And we're live. What's up, everybody? I'm back from Dubai, so the live streams are coming back in full force. We have one tonight. As you can see, we're going to do another one tomorrow night, debunking Charlie Kirk, and we're going to have a one-on-one debate with myself and Mordechai, who's a settler living in the West Bank. So lots of content coming up in the next few days. It's great to be back. I missed you all. Tonight we're going to try to bring clarity to what seems to be the most confusing electoral process in the history of the world. I myself am not qualified to speak on this issue, so I brought our Sulha Middle East analyst, Ari Brodkey. Ari, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me again.
Before we get started, just a few of our formalities. A big shout out to our Patreon visionary members. We have Trivium Energy Pty Ltd, SOG Cannabis, Max Marine, Geffen Posner, Adam Albelia, Maya, and our one and only champion member, Raja. If you're new to the channel, like and subscribe. And also, if you just know that the explanation on our electoral process is probably going to be 10 to 15 minutes. The live stream will continue for probably around an hour. So if you're watching this after the fact and you just want to get the gist of it, you won't need to watch a full hour to see what's going on. We'll have a nice conversation, general conversation about politics in Israel after the fact. We'll take audience questions and just chit chat about fun stuff. I do want to share with you all a new platform that we just launched. It's called BBS. It's kind of like Reddit, but it's built on blockchain. So it's like a decentralized version of Reddit. You earn money for making posts, and you even get money just for signing up. It's a cool economy. Consider it the Sulha economy. It's a new platform, but it's developing, and we're kind of testing it out firsthand. Disclaimer, I actually work for this company. For those who don't know, I make a living working in blockchain. Sulha is my passion project, which I hope to be able to do full-time at one day. But for now, I do blockchain, which I consider a brilliant and transformative technology. I dropped a link to BBS in the description. Join our community, share your ideas. You earn money just for signing up, and you earn money just for making posts. It's pretty cool. If you have questions about how it works, you can reach out to me. We'll chat about it. And with that, Ari, what's going on? I guess first we'll do like a high-level overview of how a parliamentary system works, and then we'll try to understand the state of the current system, like where we're at right now.
Yeah, that's a really good idea because parliamentary systems, multi-party parliamentary systems are really confusing to people who aren't used to them. And, I guess the frame of reference, the point of comparison here that we're kind of thinking about in the back of our minds is like the American system, where even though it's not written down that it's two-party, it seems a lot simpler. You have what are called single member districts and first past the post and things like that are really complicated political science ways of saying things like, if you get 51% of the vote, then you win the whole, election, even if, it's only a very slim majority. So in Israel, we have a parliamentary system, a multi-party parliamentary system, which is very different from that. One of the arguable advantages to the system that we have is that it's considered more representative. What does that mean? It means that because there's multiple parties, it's not just a two-party system. You obviously have a much wider range of different demographic groups and different political interests that are represented. So that's one aspect of it, but also that the representation is proportional to the vote. So unlike in the States, let's say, in my county, a Democratic candidate gets 51% of the vote and the Republican candidate gets 49% of the vote, then 49% of the votes that were cast get thrown in the trash, essentially, right? That's 49% of the votes that people have cast are essentially ignored and don't actually factor in to who is going to be representing them in the national government.
It would be like it's a winner take all model in the United States.
Exactly. You call it first past the post, winner take all. It all means, both of those things mean the same thing, which is that, if you get a majority of the vote, then that's enough. And it's not just necessarily an issue of like having more votes. So like, for example, in states like Georgia, we saw a runoff election. And what that means is that neither candidate got more than 50% of the vote. So it automatically had to go to a new election until one of them got over 50% of the vote. So that can be it really depends on what the election laws are. And in the States, it's really confusing because you have the election laws for federal elections are often set by states, which is good and bad. But this is Israel. It's a much smaller country. It's not a federated system, and it's not divided into voting districts. The whole country is one voting district. It's not based on geographic representation, but it's based on party representation. And what we have is what's called a party list proportional representation in what's a closed list method. What does that mean? It means that when I go to the ballot box to vote, I'm not voting for an individual. I'm voting for a party, and that party has a list of people in it. So let's say we're looking at a party like Likud. So the Likud is a party that I'm voting for, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, and then the number 2, number 3. By the way, just to clarify, this is an example. I'm not saying that like I necessarily am voting for Bibi. I don't want to shoot my credibility in the foot right away. Not that there's anything wrong with voting for clearly people love doing it. So more power to them. So when I go to vote, unlike in the States where you go to a ballot box and it's like, do you want Joe Biden as president, Kamala Harris as president, Donald Trump as president, Mike Pence as vice president, things like that. Instead of voting for those individuals, you vote for the party, and then the party has a list of candidates. So what happens is that you vote for that party, and then those votes are tallied, and you have 120 seats in the parliament. That harkens back to there's like some very ancient Jewish traditional symbolism about that from back in the days of the Kingdom of Israel, the sort of great assembly of 120, and that's why it's that number. But what does that mean? It means that if a party gets 10% of the votes, then they'll get 12 seats in the Knesset, right? It makes sense. It's proportional. And like I said, what's sort of nice about this, in the sense that it's very representative, is that in Israel, the political left and right axis is not exactly the same as, I wouldn't say not exact, I would say it's entirely different than everywhere else in the world. Generally speaking, when you think of the political left and right, it's along economic lines, right? It's about sort of, like government intervention in the economy, big government, small government, sort of libertarian social policy versus very conservative social policy. That's like generally the divide. In Israel, we decided to take that kind of an axis, and then we decided to overlay like 3 other axes diagonally over it. So for example, you have the divide between secular and religious, and that's just like within the Jewish community, right? And then add into that also within the Arab community, within the Muslim community specifically, you have like the more secular politically oriented and the more religious politically oriented. So that's already another 2 axes. Obviously, urban versus rural politics is a thing everywhere. In Israel, we call it center versus periphery, because the center is like sort of the coastal plain of Israel, where you have Tel Aviv and a lot of these major cities, and then the periphery is basically everything else. It's all these smaller towns that sometimes they feel like they're neglected, or they have different development needs. So that's another divide that's very common. And then probably the most prominent left-right divide, when we say left-right in Israel, generally speaking, we're talking about in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Left being sort of, I would say, a very conciliatory, peace-first approach. I wouldn't say like, if you take it to the logical extreme, obviously it becomes peace at any price. Whereas, if you go to the right, then it's like much more hardline, hawkish. And then if you take it to its extreme, it's that, no such thing as peace, only absolute victory, that kind of thing in regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So you can already see that when we say left-right in Israel, it gets really confusing. That divide isn't necessarily clear. And especially because you have a lot of different overlap.
I guess I want to interject something, because I never thought about this. You're right that is the most prominent axis, but it's not like the people demand some coherent policy. They just want to kind of know. It's almost just they want the rhetoric to match what makes them feel good. So it's not that the constituents don't demand an actual plan, like a coherent plan for the Israel-Palestine conflict. They just want to know that the words you're saying sound good to them, and that is what appeals to them essentially. Would you agree with that?
I'd say yes and no, because the what's really interesting is that different demographics in Israeli society have different expectations of political parties. So what does this mean? Like, some parties have a really clear platform, and in that platform, they prioritize, let's say, internal socioeconomic domestic issues. So there's like a very clear action plan and list of priorities in regard to that. And like you said, in regard to the conflict, it's sort of like, very general language about like,
Right.
yes, in favor of a two-state solution and like open to the possibility of this, this, and this, provided that that the dialogue exists and there's a partner and it's fruitful and whatever. But at the end of the day, most Israelis are not voting for a party based on how they think they're going to handle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because a lot of Israelis, especially since a lot of security infrastructure has been built and the intelligence community has gotten a lot more advanced in its capabilities, and we've sort of been able to limit the threat and the sort of immediacy of the conflict in the lives of most Israelis. A lot of people can sort of put it on the back burner as a policy priority compared to economic well-being, compared to let's say equality under the law, which is a big one. We can get into like some of the differences between the parties and the policy issues later on. But overall, the system is designed that you have all of these different parties that cut across all these different dimensions. Usually an average election, you'll have anywhere from 15 to 20 parties running an election, and it will result in 10 to 12 parties making it into the Knesset. What does that mean? You have a threshold. You have an electoral threshold where if a party doesn't get at least 3.25% of the vote, if it doesn't represent at least 3.25% of the Israeli populace, then it does not cross the threshold, and it's sort of like nullified, and the calculation is done without that party in the mix. So, if a party really appealed, like a great example of this, I think in one of the several elections we had in the last couple of years, was there's a party that really prioritized the legalization of cannabis, right? And ultimately, there's a lot of hype around it. A lot of people said they were going to vote for that party based on that. And it turned out to be
the Greenleaf Party.
No, not even Greenleaf.
Oh, not them.
Greenleaf has historically done that, but this time it was a bit of a nutty party altogether. But Zehut with Moshe Fleischman, it was very weird party. But one of their main issues was like, we're going to legalize cannabis. That's going to be our flagship issue, and it was going to galvanize a lot of people to vote for what was otherwise pretty fringe individuals. And eventually, they didn't cross the electoral threshold, so all those votes that they did get went to the bin, and the calculation was sort of done over, right? So actually speaking, you have about 12 or so parties that make it into the parliament. Now, once you make it into the parliament, let's say I have a party and I have 30 people on my list, but only 12 of them make it into the parliament. That part of the list that's in the parliament is now known as a faction, right? So that's the faction of my party that is sitting.
Wait, Ari, I just want to back up. So if you have 30 people in your party, 12 make it in because you only get 12 seats, for example, right?
Exactly. I get a percent of the vote that translates into 12 seats in the Knesset. So even though I prepared for the contingency, I have a party list that's 30 long, that I would bring in, a much higher percentage of the vote. If in reality, actually 12 is perfect because that's 10% of the vote. If I only get, if I was planning on getting 20% of the vote, but I only got 10% of the vote, then, only those 12 members make it into the Knesset itself, make it into the parliament. That becomes known as a faction. Now, electing, when you pick these parties and when we find out how many seats each party get, that's only half the equation, right? Because that's how you choose the parliament. That's the legislature, right? Government, especially democratic governments, have usually three separate branches: the judicial, the legislature, and the executive. And by the way, I'm just going to nip this in the bud. There is no universal definition of what a democracy is in political science, in common parlance in anything. We have a lot of characteristics that we know sort of describe democracies, and we have like a checklist of things that you must have to be a democracy, like free and fair elections, like consolidated institutions, rule of law, things like that. But there's no like universal definition, so we can just sort of not worry about that too much. So yeah, you get the parliament selected, and then you have a legislature, right? You have the people who are there to make your laws. But then you need an executive branch. And here is where things get interesting. And this is how Israel found itself in the total mess that it's been in recently. So what happens typically is that the largest party in the Knesset, it starts usually with the largest party, gets from the president. In Israel, we have a president who's mostly a ceremonial role, and there's very few actual political functions that it serves. In this case,
the Queen of England.
Yeah, exactly. I compare it a lot to the Queen of England, actually, because when for anyone who watches The Crown, right, when a new prime minister comes in, they go to Buckingham Palace and they say, I'm here to form a government in your name. It's kind of like that, a lot less formal, because Israelis don't know how to do anything formal.
Right.
So the president typically goes to the leader of the largest party in the Knesset and says to them, I'm giving you a mandate of 30 days. It's usually around 30 days, anywhere from 25 to 30 days, to form a government. And then this is where it gets really interesting. You need to build a coalition that will reach a majority of seats in the Knesset. So that's 61 seats. No one party ever gets 61 seats in today's landscape, right? The biggest parties get like 30 something, which means that you need to get other parties to want to support you being in the government. And the only way that you do that is by including them in the government. So what happens is you have all of these different ministries, right? These branches of the executive, the foreign ministry, the finance ministry, the ministry of defense, the ministry of internal security. And these smaller parties, because they're so crucial to you forming a government, are able to negotiate with you. And there's a lot of back and forth about who wants what ministries, right? So let's say that I am a party that is mostly secular, mostly economically oriented. A lot of my constituents live in the periphery, are agricultural in their interests, that's their main source of income. So it might be really important for me to have, the Ministry of Agriculture portfolio. And to the largest party in the Knesset, that might not matter so much, right? They want the big stuff. They want prime minister, minister of defense, foreign minister, things like that. So I can negotiate and I can say, okay, we'll join your coalition, we'll form your government in exchange for this portfolio. So what you've had a lot of, this gets us into the weird situation we're in today, what you've had a lot of until now is, without diving too deep into the personal baggage of Netanyahu, unless we really want to get into it, is an inability of parties to compromise and negotiate and form governments that are stable and that can work in the long term, because these parties have a lot of competing interests and because of a lot of very specific social issues and what you call in political science, social cleavages between the different groups. So for example, if you have a party that is right-wing on security / Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it's pretty secular in its nature, and in that same coalition, they're sitting with ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties that are doing things that the other party doesn't like, or more importantly, the constituents of that other party doesn't like, it puts them in a really weird position, because they're sitting in a government, they're supporting the continued existence of a government that is not serving their constituents or serving against the interests of those constituents. So things like that are what lead to a collapse of a coalition. And it's actually a very simple process when it gets down to it, like once we get past the negotiation and everything. Because once you've made a coalition agreement, you simply go to the president and you say, here, I've made a coalition agreement within the time frame that you gave me, and I think it's within a week. that is supposed to be sworn into the government. And then you have a government, and then whenever, that doesn't work out for people anymore, whenever people are unhappy with it, they simply have a vote in the parliament, and it's a vote of confidence. So, right, if you're, if you've built a coalition that has like 63 votes, and there's a party with 12 votes in it, and they're not really happy being in the coalition anymore because it's not working for them, all someone has to do is call a vote in the parliament of, is there still confidence in this government? And as long as one of those parties pulls out and they don't have 61 anymore to form that government, then new elections are called and things start over, which is what we've been doing over and over here, for a variety of reasons. So like in general, that's how like the system works. In practice, there are certain ministerial portfolios and legacy parties and things that are really embedded in like the Israeli political culture that we can pick apart and dive into if we're interested. And I think that maybe the stuff about Netanyahu and Lapid and Bennett and Abbas and like these really key power players might be worth it if you're interested.
Yeah, we could get into it. We could get into the current landscape.
Gotcha. So I would just start by saying that Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, which is pretty impressive considering that it was basically a one-party state from 1948 to 1977. And that party wasn't the Likud, it wasn't Netanyahu's party, it was what was then Mapai, which then became Avoda, which in English is Labor. So it's very comparable to what you would find in a Labor Party in other, European democracies in terms of their social policy. Entirely secular in terms of their orientation on social issues, more on the socialist and welfare, like state-sponsored welfare side of things, more carefully regulated economy. That was sort of the party that was really in control from Israel's founding until 1977, when the Likud, the party that Netanyahu is now representing, at that time in 77 was represented by Menachem Begin, was able to finally mobilize and win an election. And the way that they did it was actually very interesting, because what happened was the Labor Party was predominantly, white, like Ashkenazi Jews from Europe who were pretty secular, who had a pretty European understanding of like how they wanted things to look, who, let's face it, were not exactly welcoming and sometimes just flat out like racist toward Jews of not European descent, which at that point in Israel was a huge number, right? We had something like 850,000, Jews from around the Middle East that were displaced and ended up coming to Israel all at once after 48. And so you had a giant population of people who really were not represented for a long time. And the Likud was able to sort of take that group of people and give them a political voice they didn't have before. And that was finally how they sort of broke the one party monopoly on it. So Likud and Labor are the two big, legacy parties in Israeli history. Those are like the kind of the main poles. And everything that's developed in Israeli politics over the years has sort of more or less centered around like those parties. So when you see people building coalitions and you see prime ministers, generally they come from those big legacy parties historically. And
just real quick, I did a calculation, and Bibi has been in power for 20% of Israel's existence around.
That's pretty wild. Right?
Yeah.
And this is something we can talk about like a little bit more in terms of term limits and stuff, just like the virtue of term limits, whether or not it's a good idea. Different kinds of systems have them for different, like the president in the United States has term limits, which for a long time was traditional. It wasn't actually mandated by law. And like there's some virtue to that, but like a senator doesn't necessarily have term limits, right? Some people really don't like that and some people do. Like there's a lot of debate about that. but yeah, Netanyahu has been one of the longest serving prime ministers in Israel's history. The past, I want to say 11 or so years, more than 10 years, he's
I
been
think
running.
it's been 12 this time around, 12 straight
Yeah,
this time around, and then 3 years in the late 90s. So
yeah,
15 total. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, that sounds right. And so Netanyahu has been around for a long time. I would argue that up until recently, until a lot of these scandals really started to fall on his head, he was probably going to go down as one of Israel's most influential prime ministers for sure. And I think he still is a very, very influential prime minister, just as you pointed out, by virtue of the fact he's been in charge 20% of the time.
Right.
But what happened over time was a lot of things came to light about character flaws with him, with members of his family, things that sort of alienated him from the Israeli public. There's been a lot of legal allegations and now cases that are pending against him for things like corruption, for abuse of power and improper dealings. So to give a quick example of that, and like sort of, without prejudging, letting the courts and the legal system do their thing here, but just like maybe dive into like one of these cases. So there's what's called the submarine file. So Israel purchased submarines from Germany, and the company which won the contract for the steel for those submarines had like the company that won out that contract is a company that Netanyahu has a stake in. So Netanyahu personally benefited from that deal. The legal question that needs to be investigated and asked and is going to be litigated in court is whether or not Netanyahu was part of that decision-making process that picked that contractor. Like if he exerted any influence over the state's purchasing power in a way that would personally benefit him, and that would be obviously very corrupt, right? So that's one of, I think, 4 pending legal battles that he's embroiled in. So, and obviously people have grown a little tired of him the longer he stays.
And I think that's like a key point to kind of bring us into the current state of the coalition, because it seems like we've had 4 elections in the past 2 years, and essentially what kept happening is Bibi always kind of just pulled through last minute to put together a coalition. The coalition was never stable for long. Why they weren't stable, maybe you have an analysis, but I think some of it comes down to Bibi willing to say and promise anything in the time of need, and then when push comes to shove, it doesn't quite work out the way he says, and then the coalition breaks up, and people kind of started, more and more people started losing trust in him, and then in time we had more and more parties or politicians coming out on a never Bibi stance. Like I refuse to join Bibi, and eventually, this is after 12 years, we finally had enough politicians take a stance against Bibi that he was not able to form a coalition, and an opposition coalition was able to form in its place. Now, what's interesting in this opposition coalition is that it seems like the only thing that they really have in common is that they're against Bibi. Not the only thing, but that's one of their main unifiers. And this really
I think that is the only thing. I think that is the only thing. When you hear it being referred to on Israeli news, they say it is the anti-Netanyahu coalition, because that's the only other common denominator. And I think that that you're absolutely right. We can sort of get into like his personal politics and the way he's played things out over the year. How he's sort of, this is a it's a beast of his own creation in a way.
Right. Yeah. And just on a more like theoretical level, like why I think that this coalition doesn't seem stable is because when you don't have much in common, when the only thing in common is opposition to somebody else, once that person is gone, and it's not that Bibi is going to step down from politics, but now their goal is no longer to defeat Bibi. Bibi is in the opposition now. Now they need to work together. This is where their differences, not their similarities, are going to shine. Stable, for a group to be stable long term, they need more in common than what it seems they have. And I'm just gonna, like, just on an off note, another example of this is actually like intersectional social justice movements that are kind of unifying around a common enemy, which would be the white patriarchal capitalist system. But when you get into the details of what the LGBTQ movement, women's rights movement, black rights movement, what they have in common, it's not much. It's just a common opposition. I'm just trying to draw a parallel that some people in the West might be more familiar with. But it's not, it shouldn't be surprising if this coalition breaks up within a few months. And
well,
are you more optimistic?
Let's first get through like who's in this coalition, how it actually came to be. Because like what's really interesting about this is like just how this all panned out, right? Like, so Bibi created for himself all of these different enemies, essentially. He alienated people on, to his right, to his left for a variety of reasons. Typically speaking, the governments that have been formed, the type of government that he leans on the most is a party that is a government / coalition that includes the ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties, the right-wing parties, both those that are religious and secular, and usually one centrist party, maybe, like depending on how things pan out. That's usually what the constellation has been over the last, couple of years. And I would say actually for all of my recent memory of the last 10 years of being here and watching the electoral politics, like I think that's basically been the constellation all the time. And the opposition parties, there's parties that are sort of permanently in the opposition. So a good example of that actually is just all of the different Arab parties that you have in Israel, right? Until this point, and like this is why this is such a special moment, there has never been an Arab party in the coalition in the history of Israel at any point. And a lot of that, and that's not exactly an exclusionary thing so much as it's like a self-exclusionary thing, because a lot of Arab parties perform the role of an opposition party. So what does that mean? If you're in a parliamentary system, right, a multi-party parliamentary system, it's not like, Republicans and Democrats where it can switch back and forth every so often. It's like you have certain demographics that are always going to vote for you, and they're always going to be more or less the same share of the population, and their interests don't change that much, every 2-3 years. And a lot of those interests, are pretty fundamental. So to give another good example of this, maybe not necessarily from an Arab party, is Meretz, right? Meretz is like probably the farthest left socially and security-wise party that is not necessarily like an Arab party in Israel. Like its members are mixed. You have like Isawi Frej, who is Arab, and you have like Jews on the list as well, and you've had like non-Jews throughout it in the past. And you have like this party, right? And they have a platform and they have very clear positions, but they don't exactly have an implementation plan, and that's on purpose. And that's because they always know that they're only going to capture, a certain percentage of the vote that's going to be relatively small. They're never going to be the ones who are like going to be sitting in the prime ministership or in the, foreign ministry or defense ministry or any of these really key positions. So their job is to be very, very vocal about their issues from the opposition, and to really represent those voices that they're there to represent in the parliament, within the debates and the discussions and the legislative process, not necessarily in, governing, right? So the Arab parties in Israel have historically also performed a role like that, because Arab Israelis for a very long time sort of boycotted participating in Israeli politics. It was like, it was a bit of an affront to their identity to make them like, to sort of thrust that, like, it's not like they didn't have interest, right? It's not like the Arab citizens in Israel didn't have, political interests or needs or things that they wanted from the government. It was like lending their voice to the coalition, lending their voice to being part of that government would have been legitimizing a lot of things that they didn't necessarily want to legitimize. And that's actually why today you have a lot of Arab parties that are pretty pissed off at Ram, who is now joining this coalition, right? Because it's not all of the Arab parties, it's one that's joining it. And in a strange twist of fate, that one party happens to be the Islamist, quasi-Muslim Brotherhood aligned like most hardcore right-wing Arab identitarian like Islamic party of all of them. Like, because you have like Hadash, who's like mixed and it's communist and Jews and Arabs together, and like, but this is like, full on.
And just to show like a little bit about how the axis here works, you would say on Israel-Palestine, they're probably closest to Meretz, but on social issues, they're probably closest to the ultra-Orthodox parties.
I wouldn't even like, yeah, like on social issues, I would agree in terms of like, in terms of things like, for example, in Israel, there's no
women's rights, gay rights, all that. They're
I think a good example of this though is like it's best exemplified in like civil marriage, right? We don't have civil marriage in Israel. In Israel, if you want to get married, you have to go through a religious organization of some kind. So if you're Jewish, you have to go through the rabbinate, and if you're Christian, you have to go through like the church system, and if you're Muslim, you have to go through Qadi and like all the. It's a whole process, and I think that like sort of preserving that like religious monopoly on the marriage process in Israel is something that you would have both, ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties and Ram agreeing on for very different reasons, right? Like I think that's sort of like a perfect, women's rights. So much, I don't know if it's as militant in Ram as it is in some of the ultra-Orthodox parties, because I heard, wow, the other day on the radio, this was hilarious to me, but like, don't judge me too hard for taking a position on this. Eichnel from the United Torah Judaism Party,
which is an ultra-Orthodox party.
It's an ultra-Orthodox party. It's the ultra-Orthodox party that represents Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox mostly, and Shas is the one that represents Sephardi mostly. So he was talking about a comment that another member of Knesset made, which was that if it were up to her, she would pass a law that would require that every party list was at least 40% women. And he was like, oh my God, like, could you imagine imposing that on us and you call that democracy? And I just had to laugh a little bit.
Amazing.
It's like, there's no irony like whatsoever. But like that's, it's a little different in that regard. But what we have.
I was going to say, do you want to bring up the map?
Yeah,
you can finish your thought, but we could bring it up just to break. Yeah. Let's go party by party. How many seats they have and kind of who they are.
Yeah, I want to make sure that the one that I'm currently looking at is the most updated one, because I think that I'm pretty sure that this is it.
So I'm seeing Yesh Atid 17, Blue and White 8, Israel Beitenu 7, Labor 7, Yamina 6.
I have a different one here. I don't know which that you're looking at. If you want to pull up the one that you're looking at, it's probably more accurate.
No, well, that's not a map. That's just a post somebody made. It's someone who I trust. Shout out to Sarah Tuttle Singer. That's from. She's the chief editor of Times of Israel. It's her post, but
she's an awesome journalist as well.
Yeah, she's a great
solid information. She's very good.
Exactly. That's why I'm using her as a source of information here. We haven't had her on the show yet, though. Honestly, I gotta convince her to come on. We've spoken about it; it just hasn't worked out.
Let me see if I can find the most up-to-date one, like mapped out. But in general, like we sort of, if we want to go through sort of ideologically and what their positions are, then like, more or less we can do that. Just, Likud. Wait, hold on. What did you have for your numbers one more time?
Yesh Atid 17, Blue and White 8, Israel Beitenu 7, Labor 7, Yamina 6. Of its 7 MKs, New Hope 6, Meretz 6, Ram 4. Is that?
Sorry, it's the problem is right now, because things are changing. They have the map up for the caretaker government, but not necessarily.
Okay, well, we could pull it up. It's like a model map, which is just to show like the concept of how it looks, and then we could just talk about each party. Maybe I could give like. I think you know a little bit more about the parties than I do, so I'll say like 2 words about each one, a very simplified version, and then if you feel like more nuance is needed, you could kind of break it down.
Yeah, no problem.
Are you still looking for it?
Yeah. But if you wanted to go through party by party and give sort of your take, then that's.
Yeah, I do. I want to bring it up first. Nah. You're looking for like the fully updated one?
Well, I have the list. I don't have a map that sort of shows you everything, but I have a list of everyone who's.
Okay, find the map. In the meantime, we'll take one or two audience questions. Chat, now's the time. And by the way, this has been a very respectful chat. I guess because we're not talking Israel-Palestine. Emotions are less heated. There is at least a 20-minute conversation about sharks, not like sharks as in humans that act like sharks, but like the actual animal. No, it's been pretty good. Starhopper was put on a timeout for being borderline racist, but Starhopper, even you've shown much progress in the year we've been around. So kudos. Let's see. By the way, I'm going to drop the BBS link. Everyone join the BBS. It's like Reddit. It's a forum where we all talk and share ideas. You earn money for posting. It's pretty cool. It's built on blockchain technology.
You love blockchain, man.
I do. It's one of my I don't know if it's a secondary passion, but I've worked in it for 3 years now. It's, the piecework has really been my true passion. Connecting between people, talking about different ideas, learning, all that, like that's my true passion. And not only exclusively Israel-Palestine, just general, broader politics or social causes in general have always interested me. Not always, but for at least the past 7 years. But, I don't really earn much money. Sulha makes some ad revenue, and our awesome patrons are great. By the way, if you want to support us on Patreon, you can find a link in the description. But no, I need to put food on the table. So if I'm going to work in anything, blockchain is like cutting edge, potentially transformative, disrupts multiple industries, very intellectually challenging. I still don't fully understand all aspects of it, not even close. It's so complex. So, Jordan, okay, so we're getting blockchain questions, or at least crypto. Will Israel government adopt the digital currency? Well, I think in the sense that just everything's going to be digitized, yes. They don't really have a reason to put their money on blockchain. The whole concept of blockchain is to distribute. It's like a decentralized ledger. So right now, essentially the nation controls the money. They could decide to print more. They could decide to burn if they want. This is how the monetary system around the world works. The problem, as we see with this, is that nations can decide to just print money at their will. 20% of US dollars were printed in 2020. Now, some would say, well, yeah, we had a pandemic, we needed that money to keep businesses afloat. That is a good point. But at the same time, when you print more money, you lessen the value of the dollars people hold. So when the government decides to print money, it's essentially taking money away from people. So it's not hard to understand why people wouldn't be so happy with a deal like that, where the government could just essentially lessen the value of their net worth. So when you park it in something like Bitcoin or another deflationary currency that can't just be printed at will, it feels much more secure than being in the hands of a government that can just print as much as they want. That's a very high level one use case of blockchain, but blockchain is also disrupts
But there is a big difference though between a blockchain digital currency and a just digital currency in and of itself. So you have a few national governments that have already toyed with the idea of having a digital currency, and there's actually a central bank for central banks digital currencies that exists. Like, this is something I had to research a while back. And there are advantages to having a digital currency in terms of things that you can do with it, and taking all the benefits of like smart contracts and things like that, being able to track where money is going. And also what you're describing there with money supply and inflation is something that you could also regulate in theory. Like, the people who manage Bitcoin do that in a sense by limiting the supply of Bitcoin, right? Like, they keep the value of Bitcoin high by limiting the supply of it. So this is something that governments can also do. But the real difference here is that, and the reason why it'd be fundamentally different if a government has a digital currency is because, think about, if your state government wants to build a road, they need cash to do that. They need to be able to pay workers and rent the equipment and like contract out the company and like do that. And part of the way that they do that, they make sure that they have that cash on hand, is through fiscal and monetary policy, right? So state currencies, like a digital currency, like imagine a digital US dollar, would function the exact same way as like a tangible US dollar, in terms of you would increase or decrease the supply of it based on how much liquid cash you need to like do an infrastructure project. Whereas blockchain is very much consumer oriented. Like, by changing the value of a blockchain currency, we don't necessarily have the power to like make enough liquidity for a government to do an infrastructure project. You know what I mean? Like, just the needs are different. Like, it's consumer oriented.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Just the thing with blockchain is it's not just trying to replace fiat currency. That's just one use case. Like, that's what Bitcoin intended to do. It didn't even work out that way. Bitcoin now is similar to digital gold. It's just a store of value. People see it wise to park some amount of your money into Bitcoin, kind of like buying gold or buying bonds, or just something you'd want to hold long term. But what blockchain essentially is, it's just a way to keep a database in a way that's decentralized. So instead of one party, whether it's a bank, whether it's something in the healthcare industry, supply chain, right? Databases exist in industries across the world, and there's always a question as to trust when it's held by one institution. So here, essentially, by decentralizing it, you're cutting out the middle. It's not only trust, it's also trust and cost of operation, because the person who stores the data takes money for that. But if you could distribute the ownership of the data to many parties, well, then not only do you cut out the middleman, it's considered more trustworthy, but it's also cheaper to use, because you don't get the fee that the middleman is currently taking. Actually, I'm going to use the word middle person, because middleman is gender term. We're moving past that. It's 2021, friends. So
Adar.
Yeah, no, sure. Cut out the middle person.
So I found, back to Israeli politics, because actually we found something simpler in the form of Bitcoin. How terrifying is that? The blockchain is easier to explain than Israeli politics. I found a map, I think. I have two screens here, so I can try and share. Let's see what happens when I do this.
Yeah, it'll pop up, and then I just need to accept it. But yeah, friends, honestly, chat, if you guys like cryptocurrency talk and blockchain, just post in the chat like more crypto, and we could do live stream just about cryptocurrency. It's in line with what we do at Sulha, because it's really all about changing the world. So cool. Yeah. Let's add this to stream. Boom. Cool.
So I'm pretty sure that this is accurate. And maybe before we even dive into like what makes these parties interesting and like unique, someone was talking in the chat a little bit about like, in their view, Bennett's a sellout. So let's maybe like from the onset point out a couple things. One, the coalition that just formed is forming on the back of the greatest political crisis in Israel's history. Like, we have never had a repeat election from a failure to form a government. Because like, think about it. If the biggest party in the Knesset, let's say, we have the screen up, right? Let's say Likud, which is this big block of dark blue right here. If they can't form a coalition, then it just goes to the next biggest party. And then usually, someone can form a coalition, right? Like if you didn't have 61 people who were happy here, you might have 61 people who were happy here, right? So usually that's what happens. This is the first time that Israel has ever had to have a repeat election, and that's happened now 3 times, right? So it's an unprecedented political crisis, and there's a lot of I guess you'd say fatigue, like ideological fatigue, in the sense that like people are really trying to be pragmatic about like how they go about this, not necessarily because they agree 100% with the people that are going to sit in a government with, but you just need a government. Like we need to pass a budget. We need to like move things along at this point. And the people who are aligned against Bibi would argue that he's been very consciously in favor of not having a government, like that he would rather that there is no government in Israel than have a government be without him in their view. So like that's a very important caveat to put here, which is how we ended up with this weird convergence, this crazy mishmash of parties that we're going to point out believe in very different things. But I think that I have a different diagnosis than you, Adar. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about the long term, but we can get to that in a bit.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to hear it. For me, it's expressing everything I know about structures and stability when it comes to similarities and differences. Not an expert on it, just what I've observed throughout the years, but I'm definitely open to hearing a different take. So we'll run through the parties one by one. I'll do like a quick 3-word explanation and you could elaborate, unless you think 3 words is enough. So we have Yesh Atid, which got 17 seats. This is Yair Lapid's party, and we could call it a secular, anti-ultra-Orthodox centrist party.
I would say that's mostly right. I wouldn't even necessarily call it, I would say that it's secular in terms of its political orientation, or more accurately, I would say it's agnostic, because you can be a religious person who supports Yesh Atid. Their primary, this party started with Yair Lapid, I think it was in 2012, I want to say, in the 2012 election. It means in English, there is a future, and the idea is that there's a lot of things in Israel that just don't have long-term plans, and Yair Lapid was a media personality who sort of came out of that world and into politics with the idea that like we're going to have a very clear vision. If you want to look online, there's like the 7-point plan, which is like there's sort of very clear policy priorities, and they're all very centrist in terms of basically everything, in terms of economics, in terms of social issues. When you say anti-religious, I would say that
anti-ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah, when you say anti-ultra-Orthodox, I would say like we need to clarify what that means.
Agreed.
Because there are several parties that are anti-ultra-Orthodox, but they're not anti-ultra-Orthodox in the sense that like, these are big just state-sanctioned hate groups, like religious,
right.
All hate a religion. It's that ultra-Orthodox people in Israel receive certain benefits from the government and certain exceptions to things like, for example, mandatory military service. And there's a lot of resentment over whether or not that is fair to have sort of different expectations of citizens based on religious status. So that's when we say anti-ultra-Orthodox, that's what we mean. There's a few parties that are like that.
Right. Yeah, it's not that they think it's by no means that they think there should be any law or violence or actual hate towards ultra-Orthodox. It's more the benefit they get from the state or even their control over politics. So they'll like refuse to sit in government with ultra-Orthodox parties. Next, you have Blue and White, which is Gantz's party. What's his first name? How am I blanking on his first name?
Benny,
right, Benny. Yeah, everyone's named Benny. Yeah. So he was actually the general when I was in the army. Believe it or not. Yeah, Benny Gantz. Yeah. He got 8 seats, and I don't even know how different they are from Yesh Atid. Maybe they're a little bit more hawkish on Israel-Palestine, taking like a general stance, and less focused on the ultra-Orthodox. That's like at least the distinction I make. But You might know a bit more.
I think that's a pretty fair characterization. The thing that really makes them stand out in my mind is the fact that their list, right, that they're not just their whole party list, but their faction, the members of their party who are in Knesset, this little cluster of light, turquoise dots that you see here. It's basically all former high-ranking officers in the army. In Israel, it's what we call bitchonistim, like people who are like, the security guys. And their sort of view of not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but sort of governance in general is very influenced by that. I have very mixed feelings about it, just because I think that military decision-making and democratic decision-making are really a lot of times at odds with each other. And these are people who sort of look at solving problems and like managing people and organizations through a very specific lens. One of their big things that makes them, I would say, different from Yesh Atid is, as you said, they're a little bit more hawkish in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but not in the sense that it's at the expense of the Palestinians, more in the sense that they want to be very decisive about what Israel's long-term policy objectives are, even if they're ones that are unpalatable to the other side. Like they would be more in favor of a unilateral decision about what Israel's going to do to solve the conflict than a negotiated settlement.
Okay, cool. Next, we have Israel Beitenu, which is Israel Our Home. This is run by Avigdor Lieberman, who is an interesting guy.
Very interesting guy.
I like him.
It's very.
I'm not going to say I like his politics, but like, there's something about him that's just like. Actually, I'm gonna get shit for saying I like him, but I like the fact that he's a character. I like the character that he is. So that would be also secular, anti-ultra-Orthodox, perhaps even more anti-ultra-Orthodox than Blue and White, and I would say a fair amount more hawkish when it comes to Israel-Palestine than both Blue and White and Yesh Atid. And Avigdor Lieberman has also been the kingmaker the past few elections. Maybe you also want to explain the concept of kingmaker in addition to expanding on that.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting. First of all, your characterization of Lieberman as a character is like, that's the best word I could think of to describe him. We did a simulation when I was in college. It was right before the first round of these elections in 2019, whenever it was. Can't even remember when the first one was. It was March 2019. We did a simulation where we sort of predicted more or less accurately based on polling what the outcomes were going to be, and then had like sort of a mock coalition negotiation. And in that negotiation as well, Lieberman was the kingmaker, meaning that this was the crucial party. When we say kingmaker, by the way, remember, you have to get 61 seats, right? So if you're a party that's 7 seats, you're certainly not the biggest, and you're sort of barely in there to begin with. But if you could tip either way, you could do a left coalition or right coalition, depending on what your priorities are, Israel, Palestine, or social issues. Then you become the kingmaker. You become the vital piece of the puzzle that helps someone get that majority that they need. When you say that they're more ultra-Orthodox, that's definitely correct, and a lot of that has to do with like the demographics in Israel. So Lieberman is of like his background is former Soviet Union bloc, and he sort of represents a lot of Jews from the former Soviet bloc, right? People who who were, after they started letting Jews out of behind the Iron Curtain in the 80s, a lot of them came to Israel. And he really speaks to that demographic. And that's a demographic that really, really struggles with the ultra-Orthodox monopoly over certain institutions in the state, particularly things like marriage, right? So if you want to get married and you're Jewish, then you have to like go through this ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, and they ask a lot of very invasive questions, and there's a lot of very offensive, I guess you could say, value judgments placed on people based on their religiosity, or not just their religiosity, but where they're from originally. So like the ultra-Orthodox community This despite there's obviously ethnic diversity within it, because you have ultra Orthodox of Middle Eastern descent and ultra Orthodox of European descent, and there's a lot of diversity within that. They've been known to, for example, be really abrasive and harsh about questioning the true Jewishness of immigrants from the former Soviet countries and places like Ethiopia, which in my personal opinion, up yours. That's not your decision to make. But yeah, so that's something that really speaks to the block that Lieberman captures. And when you say that they're more hawkish, I wouldn't say that they're more hawkish. I would say one of the big key differences here is that they are more hawkish, but they're also very openly pro-settlements, right? That's a big differentiator between Israel Beitenu and some other right-wing parties. They're secular to the point where they're anti-ultra-Orthodox. They're hawkish on Israel-Palestine. At the same time, they want sort of religious liberty and freedom from religion in Israel as well, but they're pro-settlements.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so Lieberman, like one of his positions, he wants death penalty for terrorists, amongst others. Also, it was him who pushed to raise the threshold for how many mandates you need to be a viable party. Yeah. Right, causing actually the joint list to become a thing, which kind of yeah.
Well, what you just said about that. So I remember very vividly that in the 2015 election, Lieberman's campaign slogan was verbatim "death penalty for terrorists." Like when you would drive down the highway and you saw the billboard for the campaign, it was "Onesh Mavet leMechablim," like death penalty for terrorists. That was the campaign slogan. This time around, you drive through central Tel Aviv and you see like a bus bench ad type thing, and it says equality before the law. And what you see there is a perfect example of a party like this becoming a kingmaker, because between being right-wing hawkish on Israel-Palestine issues and the conflict versus social issues of freedom from religion and countering the ultra-Orthodox, you see how a party like this is a kingmaker, because it can go either way in a coalition, either a right or a left coalition. That's a perfect example of it.
Cool. So next we have Yamina, which is Naftali Bennett, who will be our next prime minister. And I guess he's an example of this time's kingmaker, right? Is that why he, with only 7 seats, got to be prime minister, and not someone like Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid, who had significantly more mandates? You could respond to that, but real quick. They are a religious nationalist party, so also very pro-settlement, no recognition of Palestinian self-determination, and Naftali is considered what they call an ultra-nationalist. I've heard that term be used. What else about him?
So here's the weird thing, right? In my past life, I voted for Naftali Bennett in 2 separate elections. Not in recent memory, but it's happened before. And even as my political philosophy has changed and my priorities have changed, I still don't think that a lot of those characterizations are entirely accurate. And I wouldn't say that Yamina is a religious nationalist party, because you'd have to go a little bit into the history here of who Naftali Bennett is, as a guy. Super interesting, not a career politician, high-tech guy, made a ton of money.
Businessman, right? Yeah.
Businessman, sort of came into politics, out of a sense of obligation in the mid 2000s, and was a right-hand guy to Netanyahu, right? This is a perfect example of Netanyahu, reading his own opposition in the future. Basically, everyone on the political map is a creation of Netanyahu in some way or another. It's fascinating. But Bennett used to work for Netanyahu, and he left, and he was asked to lead what was traditionally always the National Religious Party. He took it in a different direction and made it what was called the Jewish Home Party, in which he took all the people who are nationalist religious and tried to also open it up to Jews who are secular but prioritize their Jewish identity, you could say. And what was interesting about that, it was a ticking time bomb, because you had the nationalist religious cadre within that bloc that was always sort of its own thing and always a lot more militant about certain things than he was. So, for example, Naftali Bennett is a lot more open-minded when it comes to secularism, and I would even say regarding same-sex couples and relationships in general. Like, even though he's a religious guy, he's very open-minded about that.
Right.
But he represented a party for a long time that a lot of members were really not cool with that, right? So eventually he sort of broke off and made his own thing. Yamina is like a weird political animal to identify. They're pro-settlements. They're definitely right-wing. I wouldn't necessarily call them ultra-nationalist. I would say that they're sort of they're very like firm. They are firm nationalists, but not ultra-nationalists, because you have like ultra-nationalists like on this map too, that we have to sort of, be able to differentiate them.
Okay.
But yeah, he'll be the next prime minister of Israel. It's going to be fascinating. He is one of the things that makes him interesting as the next incoming prime minister is that he's also, like Netanyahu, he has some American heritage, some background in the United States, which was something that Netanyahu always touted as an advantage of his, that he could really connect with the Western world really well, and that he could communicate in English effectively. And something else that's interesting is he's the first openly religious prime minister in Israel's history. He's the first prime minister
I didn't realize that.
Who wears a kippah all the time. The only other prime minister who would wear a kippah occasionally was Menachem Begin, and he would only do that when he was like, reciting a psalm or something on a speech, right? So Naftali Bennett is the first guy who's openly religious, who is the first openly religious Jew prime minister of Israel in its 70 plus years of history, which is very interesting.
Okay, breaking that glass ceiling.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Next, we have New Hope, which is also someone who can be considered Bibi's right-hand man, maybe even more so. This party is run by Gideon Sa'ar, who has been always the number 2 guy in Likud, which is Bibi's party. He just broke off last time in this last election from Bibi, which was kind of big news. And he's considered to be to the right of Bibi, and again, Ari, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what they say, to actually be truly principled. They often say about Bibi is he doesn't have real positions. He'll just say what he needs to say to get elected. What they compliment Gideon Sa'ar with is that he is right wing, but it's principled. He truly believes what he says, and he'll stand by it.
Yeah, I think that what you heard, the argument for why, I remember watching this on live TV when Gideon Sa'ar announced this party and he was leaving the Likud, and it was like earth-shattering, right? It was brewing for a long time, but when it happened, it was still earth-shattering. So what's interesting here is that this dives really into like this sort of personal politics of Netanyahu. A lot of people who are very ideologically Likudnikim and who have always been like very committed to like sort of that view, look at Netanyahu in a similar way to how you said it, and basically say that the party has turned into a cult of personality around Netanyahu. That the Likud party now is more about Netanyahu's political survival than any particular set of values or priorities the party used to have. And Gideon Sa'ar was one of the first people who basically has, articulated that in very clear terms in his speech where he announced that he was creating this party. He basically said that all of the values, all the reasons I've been in this party now have been sort of abandoned for the sake of propping up this one guy. And I've seen that one guy do irreparable damage to the party that I love. And like, I'm going to try and carry on that legacy in my own principled way. And he had some defectors with him as well. It was very interesting because it was the first, I would say, mass defection from the Likud over issues about Netanyahu's personality.
Cool.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm learning a lot. I've never been an expert in Israel politics. It's just never been my domain. I'm happy I brought on an expert on this topic.
So even when you think there's so much
you don't know. Yeah, Well, that's just like blockchain for you. Same exact thing with blockchain. When you think you don't know shit. I just realized we forgot labor. So we're going to backtrack. We have Labor with 7 seats, and that's Meirav, run by Meirav Michaeli, who I believe is the only woman head who is now in the coalition. There are other women women in the parliament, but she's the only woman running a party who's in power now. Labor is, as Ari mentioned before, the evolution of the original Israeli party. It's considered socialist. Let's call it social democracy. So more economically left than most of the other parties. And I guess they're also very left on social issues as well.
Yeah, that's fair. I would say it's the secular. Yeah, I would say like if socialist in the sense of social, like social democrats, like European social democrats. I would maybe compare them to like the SDP in Germany for people who are real political nerds and like want that sort of point of comparison. It's very interesting to me to look at a party like Labor, because remember, like this little block of 7 red dots used to be the only party that ran the state of Israel from 1948 until 1977. Like they had a monopoly over the entire political system for that entire time, and this is where they're at today. This is one of the legacy parties. That's the result of a lot of different things, some really interesting campaigning styles and choices in terms of head of party in the past that maybe weren't exactly a good fit. Meirav Michaeli, as a member of Knesset, is, in my opinion, one of the most impressive members of Knesset, alive today, irrespective of the fact that she's like easily one of the most, just powerful women in Israel in terms of her presence. Like she really, commands your attention and your respect in a way that like I really admire. I don't know if I would ever vote for her, but like there's a handful of members of Knesset that I look to and I say like, wow, this is someone who, I would never have a bad thing to say about them as a person or how they've conducted themselves as a parliamentarian. She's really a fantastic person to have at the head of a party.
Cool. Maybe she'll be Israel's second female prime minister at one point.
It'd be very interesting.
It is kind of crazy how like
another cool thing about her, by the way, you're talking about trying to use more gender inclusive language. She was one of the first politicians in Israel to do that, because like Israel's a gendered language, so we have male and female. And she was one of the first people who, like, in the parliament, I think she was the first person in the parliament who put because typically, like traditionally, you say the male and then the female. So if you were going to say, my friends, my friends and colleagues, you would say the male version and then the female version. She was one of the first people, if not the first, to say the female version first, or to refer to words in their female conjugation very consciously. And she does that. She also does it, which is very interesting, about God. She says, things about God and prayer and things like that, which are traditionally conjugated into masculine as feminine. So she's very forward thinking in that regard.
Interesting. I'd like to put it out there. I also heard that when she says like, if she'd say like, you, like speaking about a group, it could be, if it's a mix of men and women, you're going to use the male tense. But from what I understand, she'll say both, him, hin, like to say them. So my suggestion, just because I think in order for words to stick on, and I guess this is something that, I don't have a horse in this race, but I do think that simplicity helps things scale. And I think if a new genderless word were to be created, it would be easier to spread than needing to say both every time. So anybody watching this who wants to kill gendered language, and I could definitely get behind that, especially when it comes to I guess pronouns is a little different. Whatever, I don't want to get too deep into this, but like inanimate objects have masculine or feminine in many languages, which to me just doesn't make much sense. English being my mother tongue, but instead of just saying both the masculine and feminine version, just have one that's gender neutral. It's going to be easier for people to say and catch on. And if you want more people to say it, simplify it. So I'm just going to put that out there. Meirav, if you ever see this, keep up the good work, but let's get that gender neutral term. Let's spread it.
Languages like Spanish and Hebrew and languages that are gendered are really interesting in that regard. There's a lot of cool linguistic experimentation, I would say, going on around that.
Are there people trying to reform this stuff?
Yep, there's some people who've been trying to create gender neutral forms of conjugation for Hebrew. It's very interesting. I don't know if it'll catch on, but
I'd support it. I'm fluent in Hebrew, but I don't get I still mix up masculine, feminine, and my friend, he would often say, he'd correct me, and he's like, bro, don't. Shulchan, table. Can't you tell that's, I don't even know which one it is. I'm like, no, dude, I don't assign a sex to inanimate objects. They're all neutral to me. To him, he sees all objects as gendered because he grew, that's literally how he developed, using gendered language. So
it's pretty obvious to me, Adar, that when I look at a table, it's obviously a female. Duh. You tell by all the curves.
I don't know. I'm not. I was gonna say something, but I'm just opening a controversial can of worms. But I was gonna attribute to certain male characteristics, but I'm trying to reject the gender norms in general. You could be whatever you want. You could do whatever you want. You're free as an individual to express yourself as you'd like. So with that, let's make all inanimate objects gender neutral. Anyways, we're getting this is almost as off topic as our blockchain.
I mean, we're only picking things that are extremely complicated to talk about. So
I actually would like to do just a session on. I mean, it's a greater one on pronouns and gender identity and all that. That's a topic I think is interesting. I'd be happy to have a broader discussion on that at a later date, and even expand that into language and how we use it, because our language does affect how we see the world.
For sure.
Yeah. So I'm often at odds. I'm going to continue on this little off-topic tangent, but I'm often at odds with a lot of the social justice spaces, just because it's not that I don't support social justice causes. Anyone who knows me knows that I generally do. It's just what has become known as woke social justice. I think they certainly have the wrong prescription to problems. I also think they have a wrong description of the problem, but I also think that their prescription is highly flawed and often counterproductive. It's actually harmful. But one thing that I am in line with what would be considered wokeness is gendered language, in terms of that's why I corrected myself and said middle person. I actually don't think words should be snowman, middleman. And the reason for that is because the words we use actually affect the way we view the world. So when everything's man, it just gives you an internalized impression that it's a male-dominated world. It doesn't mean that that's going to cause you to view be on explicitly sexist, but it could make you internalize certain concepts which can have some societal outcome. So it seems like one way to just create a more just and equitable society is to not have one gender be preferred in our language. So I'm pretty woke in that regard. I think that's pretty on point. I don't think you should be mean to people who use gender. I think we need to be compassionate in our education and not shame or cancel. Right? That's where we're at odds. But I think there's a point to be made there.
I think that you're right, and I think that you should maybe you're. I don't know. Actually, I don't know. I don't know if I think you're right. I don't know what I think, but what I do think is that if that's how you feel, you should probably communicate that to the president of the United States, who's always saying, "Come on, man."
Yeah, and he's gone super woke, but that's true. That's true. I'm gonna have a little word with
Come
Joe.
on, man.
Yeah.
Come on, Mr. President.
Listen, we need to be kind. We need to be kind to people in his current condition. Like he's struggling. Like we got to be compassionate.
All right. Back to Israeli politics.
Okay, and actually, last but not least, perhaps the most interesting party, Ram, which is Mansour Abbas, the Islamist party, the first time an Arab party has been part of the ruling coalition. Again, we briefly, I guess we described him, but he would be Islamist. I don't know. Maybe you could explain. That's all I could use to describe him, Islamist.
I think what we need to do here is we need to look at both of these right here. So these bottom 6 dots right here, my cursor is now, and then these 4 right here. So these are all of the parties that could be classified as Arab parties in the Knesset, right? There's a total of 10. It's not a crazy amount by any stretch of the imagination. But when you see what you see here, Harashima Hamishutefet, that means the joint list. This is actually a conglomerate of several different parties. One of them is Hadash, which is a communist, like openly communist party of Jews and Arabs together. You have Balad, which is in this as well, which is another Arab party. I think it's pretty secular in its orientation. Also, I'm going to go on a limb and say they're sort of quasi-communist as well. And then I think Tal is the third one. I might be wrong. It's a bit dated. The thing is that this, as you pointed out, the joint Arab list was something, the reason that they did this is because of that electoral threshold, right? Like they would have not necessarily made it into the Knesset as parties if we were only doing it by individuals, because as you see here, if these 6 seats, which is not a big contingency at all, is made up of 3 or 4 different parties, like this is what you need to do to actually make it in. You make these conglomerations. And what was interesting is that Ram sort of defected from that, even though you would argue that they're the least likely partners to participate in an Israeli government ideologically. What they did is they sort of took on something which is very, this is going to piss a lot of people off who don't really, like this characterization, but I'm just going to put it out there because like it's factually correct. They operate in a very similar way to how the Muslim Brotherhood operates. What does that mean? It's that they are ideologically motivated, but they're also super pragmatic about politics today in the here and now. And not just pragmatic about politics in the here and now, but they understand that the way that you actually consolidate power, especially in the Middle East, especially in various Arab societies, is the way the Muslim Brotherhood has always consolidated power, which is by delivering social services to people, right? If you look at the beginning of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at like sort of the turn of the century, Hassan Banna, one of the first things that they did was they provided those social services that the central Egyptian state was failing to provide: education, healthcare, all these things. And so what they were able to do, in addition to capturing voices for ideological reasons, was they were able to make the case that, look, there are too many needs that are going unaddressed within the Arab sector in Israel, and like we're gonna deliver on those needs. Like we're going to be a kingmaker here. We're going to be a vital partner. These 4 seats, like all those 4 seats, are like a vital partner to making sure that there's a coalition now, and that makes them have a very good negotiating position relative to the power that they actually hold in terms of voting power, right? So they've set their priorities. They say that one of the things that they're working toward is like one of the main things they're working toward are several Bedouin villages in the Negev in southern Israel that are not recognized as municipalities by the state, and therefore they don't have access to the same like resources that a recognized municipality would have in terms of developing infrastructure. So they want those communities to be recognized by the state. So that's something that they can leverage their position to achieve. And their strategy is that even if we're ideologically like not even close to the other people in this spectrum, if we can deliver the goods to our constituents in a way that no other Arab party has been able to deliver the goods, in the long run, that will help us retain power. Now, there are those who are like me who sort of see an implicit danger in that, in the sense that like, wait a second, if these guys are actively not in favor of the idea of Israel as a state. That's actually one of the only parameters that can get a party thrown out or banned from running for Knesset. They've been very coy about that part of it. It's sort of like a hidden subtext. But the minute that they actually were to say that openly that they're for dismantling the state of Israel, or they're anti-Zionist or anti the idea of a Jewish state, then that would actually get them, that would block them from participating in the Knesset. So historically, Israel's blocked, like the classic example of this is they blocked a right-wing racist party that belonged to Meir Kahane, for reasons that it's obviously anti-democratic and it's not going to, work in the context of Israeli democracy. So that's a party that they blocked. So this party is very interesting in the sense that it could ideologically, if they get more militant ideologically in the long run, it can actually keep them from being able to participate at all. But in the meantime, they're trying to be pragmatic and deliver the goods in a way that no other Arab party has been able to do. And in that respect, I kind of respect them for it a little bit in that regard, because I think that there are a lot of Arab citizens of Israel who really deserve answers to the policy issues they've been living with for a long time. And I don't think that protesting and sitting on the sidelines in playing your role as a classic opposition party forever is the way to do that. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the more exciting things here, and it very much is an interesting coalition. Some people are focusing on the fact, a lot of people are just happy that Bibi's gone, but others are saying Bibi's gone, but you have somebody who's to the right of Bibi now in power. Other people are excited because for the first time you have an Arab party in the coalition, which I think that's exciting. And I agree with you that Arabs, the Israeli Arabs, and also East Jerusalem Arabs should get involved in politics. I think it'll make their activism stronger. It's cool that Meretz will, there's a lot of parties that haven't had a voice that finally have a voice. I don't think it's going to be stable. I don't think it's going to last. But, I'm personally excited by just this odd coalition to see what happens. Like, it's an interesting experiment. It's something new. The status quo is entirely unsustainable. Bibi's been in power for way too long. So I'm personally excited. Like, even the fact I'm way to the left of Bibi, of Bennett, but I'm happy he's in power, because just, let's see what happens. There's a lot of interesting things going on now. So I'm excited about it. Ari, I do want to hear why you think that this is going to be more stable. Like, well, I'm not convinced it's going to be stable, but I do want to hear what you think. I'm going to address the chat real quick, because some people have questions about my moderation, because I did put Star Hopper on another timeout. So first of all, I'll acknowledge that my moderation is not always 100% on point. I sometimes miss things. I'm not always able to treat everybody 100% fairly. So let's just put that out there. It's not perfect. But if I see somebody who's constantly engaging in inflammatory rhetoric, demonizing rhetoric, racist rhetoric, just straight up hate, then they're going to be put on a timeout. My tolerance for people is going to be greater if they are Jewish or Palestinian, because these are people who have skin in the game. If you have an outsider that's just here to cause trouble, then I'm more likely to not even put them on a timeout, but straight up block them from the channel. So Starhopper said, United joint list of terrorists, and I put him on a timeout for that. And then Mossad is asking, and I appreciate your challenge and critique. These conversations are important, and I want the community to hold me accountable if you think I'm doing something wrong in terms of moderation. But Mossad says, would you allow somebody to call Israel an apartheid state? And actually, yes, I would. There is a legitimate legal debate as to, is Israel an apartheid state or not? You could disagree, you could agree, but there's a legitimate debate. What Starhopper is doing, and again, he's a repeat offender. The fact that he's not banned entirely, like he's been just straight up racist multiple times for the past year, and he's still here. So I do take the fact that he's a repeat offender into consideration as well. But when he says joint list of terrorists, that's just more of his racism to equate all Arabs to terrorists, and he constantly does this. So the intention behind Starhopper's comment is taken into consideration. That was an anti-Arab comment. To call Israel an apartheid state, you could say it's an anti-Israel statement, sure, but it's also a valid legal debate. It's not being racist. It's not being hateful towards a group of people. So again, that's kind of the thought process behind it. But by all means, feel free to always call out and challenge my moderation decisions, because it allows me to reflect on it and see if we're really doing the best possible job we can.
Maybe to offer a different perspective on that.
Sure, yeah.
So I think it's totally valid using the word apartheid when talking about Israel in a context of here and now, I think is, obviously you're sort of entitled to use whatever language you choose, but that doesn't mean that people have to take your opinion seriously. I think that in the status quo, it's inaccurate to say that Israel is an apartheid state. I think that you would find a lot of people, including former Israeli prime ministers, several of them, who said that Israel risks becoming an apartheid state if we decide to fully annex the West Bank, to lean onto a one-state solution, things like that. That's when it becomes very clearly an apartheid state. There are some issues with calling it that now under the framework of international law, just because it's a weird situation to be in the sense that Israel hasn't fully asserted sovereignty over the territory or the people in question, and therefore, you don't have voting rights of people that you don't have sovereignty. It's a weird situation. So I don't think that that's necessarily accurate. And I do think that when you're saying maybe to not to play devil's advocate for a comment that doesn't really have a place, but I think that here's an important misconception that happens. I don't think that there's ever been, and maybe that's too bold of a statement, there are not members of the joint list now who endorse terrorism openly, right? You can wink and nod, you can dog whistle, you can say that, I support the plight of the Palestinian people and, however they choose to take up that, struggle or whatever. But there are four parameters that keep a party from running in the elections. I have them up in front of me now. 1, negating the state of Israel as the state of the Jewish people. 2, negating the democratic nature of the state. 3, incitement to racism. And 4, support of armed struggle against the state of Israel. So there's no way that any member of Knesset currently has openly called for or endorsed Hamas or terrorist attacks or things like that. I think that it's not inaccurate to say there's been a lot of winking and nodding over the years, but it hasn't been open. And I think also, for the sake of being even keeled about this, you have a lot of Jewish members of Knesset from the political right who have either completely turned a blind eye or also winked and nodded to Jewish, arguably terrorism as well against Palestinians, to Hilltop Youth and price tag attacks and things like that. And I'm really reticent to label a whole party based on its worst members or the worst things that it's done. But I think that in that respect, sort of the winking and nodding, maybe it bothers people who care for Israel more because, the people that are being winked and nodded to are actually, actively working to attack the state of Israel. So to them, it's more personal. But I do think that it's just not accurate to say they don't openly endorse terrorism. You have people who have been pretty wild and have done things that are, very borderline. So a good example of this, I feel like I need to substantiate this. So Ayman Uda, who is the head of the Joint List, a few years ago, he went to the UN and worked with the Palestinian delegation to the UN to draft an anti-Israel resolution. So that's something that as a sitting member of parliament in Israel is very borderline, right? Does not make you a terrorist. It's just very, on the cusp of probably not okay legally or principally in a lot of regards, but maybe just sort of a, asterisk all of that.
I do want to bring up the topic of apartheid a little bit more, because I'm not an expert by any means on legal definitions or how they apply. But I do know that Human Rights Watch just put out a very long report explaining why they do consider Israel an apartheid state. One of the head representatives of Human Rights Watch, Omar Shakir. He's actually willing to come on the program. We're just looking for who to bring him on for a debate with. He's very open to debating it. One thing that I did notice when this report came out is that 99+% of people who were against Israel being called an apartheid did not engage with what the actual report was saying. They didn't read the report. They got very defensive. They called it anti-Semitic. They didn't read the report. They did not engage with what the report was saying. Again, many people don't have the time to read a full report. I realize that. But if it's so easy to debunk, if Israel's obviously not an apartheid state, I would have hoped to see more people be able to just break down clearly why it's not. Generally, the two main arguments you hear, and I don't think either of these are adequate arguments. One is you say Israeli Arabs have equal rights. You know, you have judges that are Arabs. They could be any position of power. I don't think that's a good argument because when people call Israel an apartheid, they're not referring to Israeli Arabs. They're referring to Palestinians. This brings me to the second argument. They say, yes, but Palestinians aren't citizens. In order for it to be an apartheid, they need to be citizens, which from what I understood is not true. It's only true if you look at the South African example, it was citizens, but it's a more vague, up for interpretation legal definition that does not necessarily need to be among citizens. It more comes down to one ethnic group dominating another. And the Human Rights Watch report, which I admittedly had not read, explains in many instances how there is an ethnic domination that is institutionalized. Therefore, they conclude it's an apartheid state. Again, is it not? I think it's a valid debate. I don't think we should get defensive or offended. I think if you genuinely think Israel's not an apartheid state, read the report and make a case. Calling it anti-Semitic and just entirely disregarding the argument, to me, is a sign of weakness rather than strength. If it's not apartheid, make the case. Most people aren't doing that.
I have to push back on this for a couple of reasons, and one, I did read the report, and I went through the report like sort of with a fine-tooth comb. The argument that Israel is an apartheid state is not the part that makes the report anti-Semitic. There's a lot of anti-Semitic assumptions that undergird the report. A really good example of this, like a really good visual example, people like visuals, is that there's like a direct comparison they like made an infographic in this report where it's like comparing like an Israeli and a Palestinian, but the characterization of an Israeli is like a really gross caricature that's based on like some college student in America's understanding of who Israelis are, that they're like all just like girls, like Jewish girls from New York.
Right, they depicted them as like white. They did like a white versus brown person.
They did white versus brown, but not just they did white versus brown. They did white versus brown of someone who wasn't necessarily born in Israel. They did a lot of things in there that were anti-Semitic in the sense that they were designed to make Jews look not indigenous or not Middle Eastern or not part of this region, which is something I think personally, if you actively work to deny or to erase Jewish indigeneity to the Middle East, then that's anti-Semitic. Because until 5 minutes ago, historically, like it was always sort of known, that's like the call of anti-Semites through the years has been Jews go back to where you came from, and now that's like Jews go back to where you came from. That's not here. So that's part of why people said it was anti-Semitic. And I think that in terms of what you said about the definitions, you have to use a South African definition because apartheid is a word that came from South Africa. Like it absolutely makes sense. And if the standard is only about an ethnic group dominating another ethnic group, you could make that argument for any ethnic minority in any country. This is exactly why Russia invaded Crimea. Like, it's to liberate them from the apartheid of the Ukrainians, right? All these ethnic Russians who are living under the jackboot of the oppressive, like, I don't like that sort of simplification because it can be weaponized. And I mean, Hitler went into Czechoslovakia to, free the Sudetenland Germans from the subjugation of another, Slavic ethnic group. And like, I don't like that sort of characterization. It's not it's not it's not comprehensive enough, and it's not like apartheid is a technical term, and it means the institutionalization, not just how institutions behave, but institutionalization like through law and through like sort of written procedure that is replicated over time and is like accepted as convention. How they approach issues based on ethnicity. So I think that like it's not, if Israeli Arabs are under a system that is objectively not apartheid, and Palestinian Arabs are under a different system that they're under sort of like military rule. And by the way, that's not all of them, right? There's autonomy in the West Bank, like
semi-autonomy.
90% of Palestinians live under the rule of law of the PA. So like that's one thing. Only 10%
Yeah,
of
but
them.
no, but even that's partial autonomy. It's still to travel from town to town.
True. But what I'm saying is that there are obviously there's limitations on individual liberties and stuff. But the question is the basis of that ethnic or is it not? Because I would argue that if the basis of it, I would say the basis of it is probably not ethnic in the sense that, you have people of the exact same ethnicity who live on a different side of a fence who are entitled to a completely different legal procedure. And therefore if you are going to argue that there are disparate systems of governance and justice, you cannot argue that the basis of it is ethnicity. You know what I mean?
I'm not sure, because one of the reasons why there's resistance to give Palestinians equal rights across the board is a demographic concern. So Israel very well could say, 20% Israeli Arabs, that's no big deal. But if we're going to give all Palestinians voting rights, well, then it's going to be 50-50. Why should we do that? I think that you could have an exception. Like let's just say in South Africa, you had an example where some percent of Black South Africans, because they belong to a certain socioeconomic class, they had the same rights as white people. That wouldn't make it not an apartheid.
Wait, I'm sorry. I got distracted by a comment in the chat, which is that there is no such thing as autonomy in the West Bank. No Palestinian in the West Bank has any autonomy. I mean, I wouldn't say that to Shtaya or Abbas, because they would probably take issue with that comment. But whatever. But what were you saying, Adar? That like
I was saying I'm not entirely convinced that if there's some in an ethnicity that are equal, that does not by default mean it can't be classified as apartheid. And an example, let's say in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, you had, let's say, 10% of Black South Africans that, because of chance or socioeconomic class, they had equal rights to white people, but all other Black people didn't. I think it could still be considered an apartheid state.
No, but the difference there is that no, because the basis of apartheid was race. The fact that you might have had, sort of an upper class within Black South Africa did not discount the fact that those individuals were still excluded by law from participating in the same institutions and doing the same things as their white counterparts. Like even the most powerful Black man in South Africa under apartheid was still less powerful than the weakest white man, right? That's something that's worth considering. But also, what we have in our head, and particularly in probably yours and my head, is we're really uncomfortable with this idea of sort of like different demographics and like taking an issue with like prioritizing state policy around demographics and like preserving demographic balances and stuff. There's actually a lot of diversity in terms of how different countries handle multi-ethnic societies and like how they handle the process of sort of coexistence. And I mean, you can compare the sort of French model of like uber assimilation, where it's like once you show up in France, it's like abandon everything, you are French. Like, it's like you have to conform to like this sort of, vastly applicable French identity and like abandon a lot of things in order for you to become French. And therefore like, this new thing. I think American the American model of a melting pot might be a misnomer, but it's sort of similar in the sense that like you have to ideologically accede to these ideas in order for you to be considered an American. And like, in places like Germany, the integration process is different. And what's interesting about Israel is that it is an ethnic nation state, which is not super duper common in the modern space. Today, it wouldn't have surprised anyone in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It was pretty common practice. And what's interesting is that now Israel is having to reconcile with the fact, it's always had to reconcile with this, but now it's doing it in a much more frontal way, that it is an ethnic nation state, but it also really values that sort of pluralism. So it's figuring out which of the different approaches, if you sort of look across Europe and the different strategies that they've taken, it's trying to figure out which of those makes the most sense. The people who are on the Israeli right would argue that, a one-state solution would, like a one-state solution would not actually create this sort of demographic, nightmare for Israel the way we think it would, Arabs, Palestinians, however you want to identify, they'd still be a minority. And that's not really a concern. And also so what, we're, an ethnic nation state, so we'll prioritize this ethnic group, big frickin' deal, other people do it. I don't think that's a sufficient answer. I don't think that's a compelling answer at all, but that's an argument that some people make. But yeah, I don't know, if we're coming back to the question of apartheid, it's so important to get that right. And I think that if you want to make that accusation, then you should be a lot clearer and just say that Israel is on its way to becoming an apartheid state, not that it is currently, because that's just it's not technically true.
Well, what I'm saying is I don't think we should shy away from the debate. I hear the claims of apartheid, and I think they actually do have legitimacy. I could see a debate. I could see hosting a debate on this and somebody making a case why it's not, and being convinced that it's not quite. But let's not shy away from this discussion. Yeah.
So I was just going to say that I think that the best way I agree with you in that sense, not shying away from the discussion. I think if you look at Ehud Olmert and Tzipi Livni and Meir Dagan, I was watching a thing last night on Israeli news where they were talking about this. This isn't if you're someone who advocates for Israel abroad or something, and this word is very triggering to you, I'm not saying it shouldn't be, because there's people who use it recklessly and they use it as a pretense for some other really egregious claims and arguments that are really inexcusable. They use that sort of as a justification for it. But the word itself isn't that big of a 4-letter word. We talk about it in Israeli politics as well. And it's talked about, that word is used by people who have, I don't think anyone would argue that Meir Dagan hasn't given enough to the state of Israel, to prove that he's a Zionist, right? We can have a discussion about that word. So.
Right. Yeah. Mossad is saying, then let's not shy away from the debate over whether joint lists are terrorists or not. Absolutely not. If people think that's a viable discussion, I'd be willing to host that. As I mentioned, I've known Starhopper for a year now, and he's commonly saying anti-Arab rhetoric, and I just saw that as anti-Arab, so I put him on a 5-minute timeout. I'm sorry I triggered you so much, Mossad. But okay, last thing on this topic. Ari, I agree with you. I think I understand why people are triggered. This is the most triggered I've seen chat since the Abby Martin video. It's funny. It's
really?
Just a different. Yeah. I think the funny thing is it's the other demographic of chat that's upset now. But that's what we're all about. We're going to keep triggering people. And malasot. That's what we're all about. No, I don't want to say that. We're about more than just triggering people. But we're gonna take stances across the spectrum and bring up uncomfortable topics, without a doubt, shamelessly too. So certainly in no way going to apologize for having these difficult conversations. But I do want to say I do understand why it's triggering, because as Ari said, it's often used to make more egregious claims. Israel is often demonized. There's often double standards. There's a lot of anti-Semitism. We just saw global anti-Semitism hit new levels since, I don't want to say since forever, because the world was pretty brutal just half a decade ago, or a little over half a decade ago. But so I do understand why this is triggering. But what I want to say is this. I want the chat, anyone who's upset now, if you think there's a strong case to be made that Israel absolutely is not an apartheid state, and I see people are very adamant about this, recommend to me the best person, the best scholar who can argue this in good faith, and we'll bring them on for a debate with Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch. Let's actually work this out properly. Send me, my contact information is in the description. You know where to find me. Reach out to me, give me recommendations. We'll try to bring them on. We're going to host a real debate on this topic. If it's such an outrageous claim, if it's so easy to debunk, then you all should welcome with open arms a debate on this. One last thing I'm going to say. Even if the situation in the West Bank isn't an apartheid, I would say confidently that morally it's comparable. So we could have a semantic discussion on how you want to describe it, but I view it personally as morally comparable. Ari, I see you disagree. You could push back, but
I think it's not. I think that in order for that statement to be true, you really have to rob Palestinians of a lot of agency. Like they're trying to, like, if you don't already consider Palestine a state, then you'd have to deny the idea that there's any current exercise of self-determination, post Oslo. And I think that that's not there's they have institutions, they have rule of law, they have international recognition. What you're saying, I don't like the word apartheid because apartheid implies that you're talking about within a country. It's a system that exists within a country. It cannot be a system that exists between two countries, because that's occupation of another country. Here's the thing, right? I don't necessarily, I'm agnostic about the fact of whether or not Israel's occupying a people or a country or any of those things. But I think that most Palestinians would feel and would argue that their country is being occupied by Israel. If they saw themselves as living in Israel under a different set of rules, then the argument of apartheid makes a lot more sense. But I just, I can't think of a comparable situation where you've had a movement, not just a movement, but kind of successful movement for nationalism and national self-determination, where you can also have that claim, because that's kind of having your cake and eating it too. You know what I mean?
I could hear that you can't say it's an occupation and an apartheid at the same time. You could view that as contradictory, because if it's an occupation, if you're occupying a country, then it's housed in apartheid. I've heard that be made, but when I use the term occupation, I just talk about one population living under another country's military rule, right? It's a military occupation. It's whether it's occupying another country or not, for me, is less important. It's the fact that literally you have 3.5 million people who are subject to military court if our military thinks they did something wrong. They need to wait at checkpoints. Home searches, based on sometimes faulty intelligence. You could just go into somebody's house, wreck it, essentially looking for something that you never find. You could put curfew on a neighborhood because of one person's action. You could set up random checkpoints in the middle of nowhere just because we don't have much to do on our what's it called when you do patrol? I don't remember the term. It's been so long. When there's abuse of power, there's very little accountability. There's a lot of aggression, and even we could call it violence towards Palestinians from soldiers. Very little accountability. And if you even call it into question, you're considered a traitor, right? So all this stuff, the morality of this, that's why I say morally, I view it as comparable. And whether you're occupying another country or not, well, living under another nation's military rule is immoral, unsustainable, and our lack of willingness to do more to change it is really probably the biggest problem. It's not that we're stuck in a tricky situation, we need to be there for security, but we're doing our most to leave. That's not even part of the conversation. If anything, our expansion of settlements is ensuring we stay there. The fact that we keep it a military and not replace it with a civilian peacekeeping force of people who speak fluent Arabic and treat Palestinians with dignity and respect, that's a decision. So, call it an apartheid or not, call it an occupation or not, what's the reality of the situation? That's really what I'm most interested in.
So, I mean, but again, like I look at the Palestinian situation and I don't compare it to South Africa so much as I compare it to other situations of territorial dispute and occupation. Like, I would argue that it's way more dichotomous to look at the Palestinian situation today and compare it to like the Sahrawi Arabs in Western Sahara. And it might be like a really like fringe case, but like underneath Morocco, you have Western Sahara. It's Jesus Christ. I don't even want to get into the history of, who colonized what and who has claimed what, but you have like an independence movement that's been there since the 70s, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. They wanted to call themselves something like that. And I think it's just a lot more comparable to that in the sense that like, yes, this like Morocco subjugates those people. Yes, Morocco imposes standards against them that it couldn't realistically get away with. I mean, well, maybe, Morocco because it's a monarchy, but like, in a democratic state where you have like, sort of a Supreme Court and people who have oversight and stuff, you couldn't get away with applying these sort of like different standards to people who are under the same rule of law. And the minute that they annex, the minute that they do that to like, let's pretend for a minute they were a democracy, the minute they did that, then it would be a lot harder for them to justify why citizens in this location or of this ethnicity are subject to a different set of rules the moment that you claim full territorial sovereignty and responsibility, because when you claim territorial sovereignty, you're also taking responsibility over the people there. So that's, again, that differentiation I think is just important. And I think that, that's when people use the word apartheid in the context of Israel, what I actually think happened is that they heard an Israeli leader say the word, and then they said, see, red lights go off in your head, and it's like a good buzzword, and it gets people fired up because who is in favor of apartheid? Like no one. It's like when people label themselves pro-life or pro-choice. You don't want to be anti-life or anti-choice, right? Like it's a good messaging strategy. And on top of that, you have this like long-term conundrum that obviously needs to be resolved. And it's interesting because I've heard it, not a small number of Palestinians say that they would almost prefer, this is really odd, but they would almost prefer to sort of like be annexed or be under Israeli control for the simple reason that like when you were pointing out, this sort of military presence, that they kind of prefer the police presence in the West Bank, because like a lot of the police in the West Bank, like they speak Arabic and they actually know these communities a lot better. So like they get along better with the Israel police more like and like the border patrol police than they do with the military, which is like this weird situation if you think about it. Like it's very unexpected. And like I also saw in the chat here, like some people who are saying things like, Israeli society is in denial about the occupation. I don't think that Israeli society is in denial of the occupation in the sense let me give you like a sort of, center right wing Israeli perspective on this, which I'm reticent to say is my position, but it was my position at one time. I still like can hold these thoughts in my head simultaneously, along with a lot of other ones about like human rights and priorities and long-term solutions. But like a sort of right-wing Israeli perspective on this is the question about occupation is not whether or not there is an occupation, it's of whether or not you're occupying a people or a land. Because if you believe that Jews are entitled to all of the land, then you don't see a problem with occupying the land, but you're definitely having people there that don't want to be under your control. And in that sense, you're occupying a people, right? I don't think any Israelis like deny that, even pretty right-wing Israelis. And the question is whether or not it bothers you, whether it keeps you up at night. And I think a lot of right-wing Israelis, it just really doesn't, bother them. But then you have people who argue that, you're occupying a land that is intended to be a future Palestinian state. And then it becomes, a lot more technical under international law about things like, when an occupation is formally considered ended? What does it mean to declare sovereignty? Do you believe in what's called the declarative versus the constitutive theory of statehood? Like, is it enough for you to declare that you're a state and that's enough for you to be a state? Or do you like need to, have international recognition? And, there's like all these different technical things that happen. And that's really, really interesting. I think that in the modern age, as, maybe this is like a sort of more progressive or left-leaning value that's seeped into popular culture, like people, and especially with globalization, the idea of borders and like land versus people, I see that like is being pointed out in the chat. Like, a lot of people are like, why do we have borders? Just get rid of borders, just get rid of states, stateless society, all these things, which, pre-COVID, that argument might have been a lot more attractive, but post-COVID, it's a tougher case. But I think that, yeah, like, that's where the conundrum lies. Like there is a conundrum. It can lead to apartheid under very feasible circumstances. I don't think that we're there yet, and I don't think it's useful to characterize the nature of status quo as apartheid, because if anything, when you say that, like, you're not saying it in a way with any solution in mind. You're saying that as a pejorative to delegitimize any action that one of the parties takes. And if there's going to be a negotiated resolution to the conflict, which people used to agree on, then you're going to need both sides in there. Like it's like when people say, oh, the Palestinian Authority are nothing but terrorists that can't be trusted. It's the same flippant style of argument that's used to write off the other side and prevent any possibility of negotiation, more so than a statement of fact. It's like there's always like a little shred of truth embedded in there somewhere, but that's not how it's used.
I hear that. You wanna respond? Some people in the chat are taking issue with what you said. You want to respond directly? Have them elaborate on their critique.
Do you want to maybe just pick one out? Because like I don't know, I can't keep track. It's funny that you say this is the most active the chat has been since the
not active, triggered. Yeah, they're upset.
It's interesting to think that I'm one of the most triggering people that you have on. You have some pretty triggering people.
No, I don't think it was you. It was me. It was the apartheid claims. No, but you have upset some people, as we can see here. But no, the main triggering force was my giving legitimacy to the apartheid claim. And by the way, chat, I don't get a kick out of making people upset. I really don't. I always even feel a little bit bad about it every time this happens. I just really don't know how to navigate these very challenging topics without upsetting people. And it seems like, unless I just don't say anything, right? But if we're gonna address these topics and try to, make progress on certain things and bring people together, we're going to need to have difficult conversations. And the triggering at least, and this is what allows me to sleep at night, is that it seems just about equal on both sides of the spectrum. The pro-Palestine and pro-Israel camp on the more extreme end seem to take equal issue with things that I do. So I'm like, okay, that's like a double negative equaling a positive kind of thing. I'm cool with it. If it was only the pro-Palestine camp taking issue with me, I'd start questioning. Maybe I'm like, not being 100%. But the fact that it's coming from both ways, it's great. Sarah Harper says, "I love my fence." I don't know if it's a fence because I don't remain neutral on positions. I take stances. I just try to make them as fair as possible. And I also I'm acknowledging right now that I'm learning as we do this, right? I say things that seem to make sense to the best of my ability to analyze the situation. The framework in which I work with is really a humanist one. I do my best to view all life as of equal value, but I also try to be rational and pragmatic, because I think that humanism alone doesn't always tell you, where you need to go. Maybe you could look at the value of humanism as like a compass, but like rationality and pragmatism as a steering wheel, if you want a real world analogy. But that being said, I'm always learning and reforming my position. So, I'm not always right. What I want, what the standard I like to hold myself to, I'd like us all to hold ourselves to the standard is to be open to being wrong, to try to be honest with ourselves, to not get overly defensive. It's okay to criticize our countries. Not only is it okay, if you want to be a true patriot, I think you need to work to better your country. And I also think don't let your opposition dominate the conversation in terms of critique, right? That's like another point. If only people who hate Israel are the ones critiquing it, and people who love Israel refuse to critique it, the people who actually define the terms of the conversation when it comes to critiquing Israel are people who oppose Israel, as opposed to people who love Israel. So keep that in mind as well. And yeah, all in all, chat, I love you. We wouldn't be doing this if we didn't have our awesome community here.
There's two things in chat I want to respond to.
Sure.
One of them I'm going to defend myself, and the other one I'm just going to piss everyone off again. It's going to be great.
Yes.
Okay. Jalal Mustafa has been asking, I think, the same question a couple of times, which is about, land in Area C and access for Palestinians. It's like, yes, this is one of the technical things that we're talking about. But again, like when we were talking about autonomy and things like that and self-governance, we're not talking about Area C. That's the one place where self-governance doesn't exist. So that argument's a bit moot. But when he says, when you say things like Palestinians have agency, that's patently ridiculous. And it's clear you've never actually been to the West Bank with Palestinians going through checkpoints and harassment. Adar, do you think that in my life experience, that's an accurate statement, that I've probably never been to the West Bank or encountered Palestinians experience harassment at checkpoint?
No, I'd say that's not true.
Yeah, that's probably on its face pretty not true. And there's another question here, and this is the one that's really going to be an equal opportunity offender. And that's from Agno Stick, which is very clever. Who cares if you're occupying land or people both violate human rights? I'm going to say something that's really going to upset, a lot of people, but it's true. When you make policy, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And when it comes to something like what you said here, both of these things violate human rights. Yes, true. There's also human rights of the Israelis that the Israeli state has a responsibility to uphold. It's very difficult for the state of Israel to tell a Jew that they can't build, they can't build something, like they can't build a home on land that has traditionally been referred to as Judea. It's not a value judgment about whether or not like settlements are a good idea or the occupation is a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm saying, think about the Israeli state being put in that position, right? To tell Jews they can't live in Judea. Like there's always going to be a trade-off between anything that happens here. And that's why the language of concessions has been so central to any discussions about peace. It's always about what those trade-offs are, what each side is willing, like what costs they're willing to eat. No one's going to get out of this 100%. No one. So like someone's human rights and someone's principle, rights are going to be violated at some point down the line. And the question becomes, how do we go about that in a way that, is the least harmful to the most amount of people? I think that you could also argue that it would be against someone's human rights if in a future Palestinian state they were to expel all their Jews, right? That's not something that would be, but at the same time, they have their own demographic concerns. Long story short, there is no perfect solution here. If you're going to say, yes, this violates human rights, it's like, there's a lot of things that violate human rights, buddy. Your government spying on you through your computer right now is violating your human rights in a way. But you have to think how to move forward from that point.
So I would say you're taking a quite common Israeli position that's not entirely in denial of the fact that human rights are being violated, but saying it's for the greater good, essentially. Like
No,
making.
I'm not even passing a value judgment on it. I'm just saying as a statement of fact, which is that when you say both of these things are violating human rights, ergo they're both wrong, it's like, yes, but a lot of answers to this question are wrong, is the point I'm making.
Right, and I think one of many Israelis, and there's not such strong counterclaims, to be completely frank, but they view that certain security policies, you could call them, are needed in order for Israel to exist, right?
Yeah.
Let's just say, let's talk about freedom of movement, right? Many say Palestinians should have freedom of movement to the entire land. Ideally, I agree. I think from the river to the sea, all the people should be free, without a doubt.
So you're a no borders kind of guy?
Well, no, not exactly, because what we do needs to be grounded in pragmatism at the end of the day. There's an ideal, something we're working towards, and getting there, right? I don't think we could take down borders today. I think we could work to a world where eventually, we're borderless. It'll take time, perhaps a century or so. But Israelis are going to say, okay, yeah, that might suck that Palestinians aren't free from the river to the sea, but I don't want to die, so I'm going to value my life over their freedom. And here's the thing. Most people on earth would do that, right? So that's essentially what you're saying. And there's a strong case to be made. And most people in the shoes of Israelis would probably act like Israelis.
I don't know if I was saying that as my position, but that is something that can be extrapolated.
No, yeah. And this is a very common, this is very much embedded in the psyche of Israelis, but it's very much human nature. People will value their security or their well-being over the well-being of another, especially if that person is their enemy. And it's like expecting them to do otherwise is unrealistic. How do we go about this? Well, I think we can create, and this is a broader conversation about creating environmental conditions that allow Israelis to be safe and allow Palestinians to be free. Like, it's certainly possible, but I think anybody who on one side is Israelis seem to not even be interested in working towards a solution in which that's possible. There's zero interest in how you make the life of Palestinians better. And again, this is one of my main critiques about Israeli politics, that there's very little consideration of how to improve the lives of Palestinians when we have so much control over their day-to-day lives. We have so much control over their environment. Currently, their environment is one which is not only abusive, oppressive, but also one that will breed extremists. But on the other hand, then you have the other camp who are just saying, binational state, equal rights for everybody, essentially the destruction of Israel, which very, very well could lead to genocide of Jewish people. And whoever just doesn't even give that argument legitimacy, honestly, probably doesn't seem to care much about the future of Jews on this land. There's not much reason to think that after so many years of conflict, that if Jews are once again a minority in this land, then they'll be safe. It's just not, there's no reason to be confident in that claim. It's possible that we'll be safe. It's possible, but to be sure about it, there's no reason to be sure about it.
There's one person in the chat who's been
shy.
Yay. Here's two things. One, you can parse out an idea in a conversation between two people without it necessarily being an endorsement of that idea. That's number one. I know that might be difficult to grasp, that people would utter words that you think are reprehensible for the sake of just uttering them and hashing that idea out in a conversation, but it happens, and it's actually good when it happens out loud. And the second thing here is about and it's not even necessarily shy. It's just in everyone in general. This isn't a contest. It's not a contest, but it wasn't even the main issue that we were seeking to talk about today. We were talking about the Israeli elections and the Israeli political system. I think what you just said now, Adar, is absolutely right, which is that because we've been so distracted with a lot of petty nonsense over, politics of personality and a political crisis here in Israel for a long time, maybe once that's behind us, we can actually bring discussions of this back into the forefront. And I actually think that there is movement in that direction after this last conflict in Gaza. I think that there are enough people now who are realizing that because of that specific problem, because of the fact that it's a thing that keeps repeating itself over and over again, a lot of people are saying, okay, we need long-term strategies now. And when you're talking about long-term strategy for Gaza, that's inherently going to initiate like a discussion about long-term strategies for the West Bank as well, because ultimately everyone's in agreement that if there's going to be a Palestinian state, it's going to be unitary, and both of those entities are going to be a part of one Palestinian state. You're not going to end up with two, right? Which is sort of de facto, what you might have now, I guess you could say. But again, like, this is, the question of how much control Israel has over the lives of Palestinians and how we need to wrestle with those issues is something that the Israeli public really hasn't had to deal with for a long time. And when they did have to deal with it, by the way, when they were sort of like forced into dealing with it, this is something I try to explain to a lot of people. It's like, if you really want to help the Palestinian cause as much as possible, and you have to choose between carrots and sticks with Israel, you should not choose sticks, because if you've ever met an Israeli, when you try to coerce them into doing something or you back them into a corner, they become even more aggressive than they were before. Like, Israel, when it feels international pressure, is when it acts the most aggressively unilaterally. If you pay close attention to Israeli policy, and if you believe that that telling Israel and Israelis specifically that 100% of the onus for resolving the conflict is on them, then their answer to that is going to be, okay,
yeah,
exactly, and
right.
like, and a certain point, you have to just be pragmatic about it, and like, yeah, like regardless of any ideological commitments or any sides or any priorities that you have, you just have to be pragmatic about it, and like, I don't really know how to make it more clear than that, other than to try and have some, optimism about what the future of this Israeli government is going to hold. I really just hope that this is, the transition that we need, to get into real discussions about problems that we have in Israel. I'm also going to say something else, which maybe, doesn't really sink into people's heads so much, which is that the conflict is like, Israel is not only the conflict. Like, if you ask Israelis what they're voting about on a daily basis, like, the parties might be able to be delineated based on like where they stand on the conflict and security issues, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Israel is defined by the conflict. Like, if you talk to Israelis about what they're actually concerned about on a day-to-day basis, this is so far down the list. And I think, if anything, that's a good sign for Palestinians. Right. And like, ironically, you know what I mean? Like, the Israelis don't feel as threatened by Palestinians as they used to, puts Israel in a situation where concessions become more possible. Right. Because Israelis are more concerned about things like their economic well-being and the quality of healthcare they're receiving and inequality within Israeli society and things like that. I think that that's, actually probably promising for the Palestinian cause in the long run, in a weird, counterintuitive way.
Interesting. I'll need to think on that a little bit deeper. What I will say,
because think about what happens like when it's the opposite, right? Think about what happens when Israel's like when the Palestinian issue is at the forefront, right? The situations where that's been the case, like, think of like the first Lebanon war, for example, when like there was a legitimate like existential threat posed by militants in southern Lebanon to Israelis in northern Israel. And how did Israel respond to that? In a horrible, like, it turned into like a worst possible situation it could have turned into. You know what I mean? Like, trying to leverage that sort of like Palestinian hard power, or like it hasn't worked historically, and it's weird in that way. It's at this point, I look at something like Palestinian armed resistance and I say to myself that like, even if it's justified, against military targets, it's not working. It's not achieving the goals that you want. It's achieving the opposite effect on a lot of fronts.
I agree to a large extent, but
it's weird.
Isn't it true that after the first and second Intifada, we did go back to the negotiating table? Like that did bring negotiations back. So,
but not because of it. You know what I mean?
Are you sure it wasn't connected to that?
Yeah, because we came back to the negotiating table because of international pressure, and then what resulted from that international pressure wasn't the outcome anyone was hoping for. You know what I mean? Like I hear what you're saying in the sense that like the idea is that when the situation gets so bad that it forces you to negotiate, that like maybe there's some value in that, but if you just look at like how these negotiations played out chronologically, it doesn't really pan out that way. Like the negotiations that follow every conflict that we have are less than fruitful, right?
Yeah. What I will say, and again, people who are the weaker group don't have the same means to fight, right? So that's what generally breeds violence and terror attacks, because they don't have a military to fight with. There's like an ethical question, right? Is it legitimate to engage in acts that are considered terrorism? And then there's a question of effectiveness. I think that historically, guerrilla tactics, or even things that would be considered terrorism, in certain situations may have worked. And if an oppressed group has been unoppressed through using violence, I'd say that there could be a moral claim to be made that it's okay. Again, I'm thinking out loud. This isn't a hill I would die on, but I am definitely open to this, right? Well, terrorism being okay as a means to an end. Wait, just real quick. But when it comes to effectiveness, I am more in line with what you're saying, because Israel has moved to the right, very much to the right. We've become more hawkish, and a lot of it is due to rhetoric and experience. There's terror attacks, there's failed negotiations, there's rejection of peace deals, and then there's political rhetoric that capitalizes on those events that kind of bring the population further to the right. So it's very true that if there was very little history of Palestinian violence, and when there was violence, Palestinians would go to the streets and condemn it. And if Palestinians en masse would recognize Israel's right to exist as a state, but simply fight for their liberation, not fight for the dismantling of the country, well, then the Israeli population, without a doubt, would be much more to the left, much more. What?
I don't think anyone would fight.
No. Like, right, well, that's what I'm saying. It's this conflict.
It's a weird thing.
The violence Israelis have experienced, the rejectionism and the calls for Israel's destruction have very much brutalized and radicalized the Israeli people. The same way the occupation has brutalized and radicalized the Palestinian people. The nature of the conflict is making the people less equipped to live peacefully with one another. This is one of the saddest realizations, about the nature of this conflict. How do we really, like, the amount of pain and trauma we need to heal from, the environmental conditions which we need to create in order for peacemakers to be born is so immense. I try not to lose hope. I still do this because I believe that there's a path forward, and I do believe that what we're doing here helps to change the environmental conditions, even to a small extent. Why? Because it gives people hope. It shows people another side. It teaches people about the opposing side, about a side they otherwise might not know much about, right? So this is our small part to just to get people more equipped to being peace-oriented people. But the amount of work that needs to be done for it to happen is immense, and I think we need to be honest about this.
Yeah. I don't disagree with anything that you just said in principle. I think it's fair. And I think that when it comes to the current constellation of of Israeli politics, I'm in a weird position of hope, I think. I think I wonder, yeah, like it's sort of back to what I was saying before. The more Israeli political leaders are able to not be distracted by, interpersonal issues. And I didn't even really get into the sort of, the weird and wild backstory of Benjamin Netanyahu and how he created all of these different political rivals, like in less than a sentence, maybe that's a pity to get to it this late. Is Netanyahu bought into his own mythology a long time ago, and that mythology is that only he is situated to lead Israel through the complex and difficult circumstances that it finds itself in on a regular basis, in terms of engaging diplomatically, making decisive security decisions, all these things. So he bought into that mythology a long time ago. And what happened was, as soon as people would come into his orbit that could be potential, helpers to him and people who could like advance his political career, the more as they became a threat, he ousted them. So he never planned for the day after he wasn't there. He said, only I can save Israel. And he never groomed, he never had a Robin to take over after Batman.
Interesting.
Right? And all of these people that you see around him now who used to be a lot. Tzipi Livni used to be in the Likud, like Naftali Bennett used to be in the Likud, Gideon Sa'ar used to be in the Likud. Like, these are all people that, he had in his orbit that, he sort of pushed aside because of his own politics of personality, this very myopic understanding that the challenges that Israel faces are so complex that that you need like one man who can handle it all. And I think that's putting way too much trust on a human being to begin with, on a singular human being to begin with.
It's like a savior complex of sorts.
It is. It's exactly that. It's a savior complex that has matured and festered for a really long time.
Right.
And I think that maybe if we can dig our way out of it, I actually think that the fact that you had Naftali Bennett, Gideon Sa'ar, Mansour Abbas, Merav Michaeli, Lapid, Gantz, Tamar Zandberg, and who's
Horowitz, Nitzan Horowitz.
Nitzan Horowitz. Like, the fact that you had them all sitting in a room, first of all, it's amazing because we don't actually ever give enough credit to the fact that members of Knesset actually know each other and get along with each other very, very well. Like, perhaps the most culturally diverse group of friends and colleagues that exists in Israel is the Knesset, in like a weird way. We like to watch politics as a team sport, so we don't ever see that. But like, the fact that you had all these people sitting in a room is so, and not just sitting in a room, but agreeing to form a government and divide up power in a way that they're all willing to sort of live with. And there's like these rotations and these balances, and they're trying their damnedest to work it out because of this crazy situation that Netanyahu created. It makes me optimistic. Like, it really does. It makes me think that, like, after experiencing like all the crap that we have in Israel and like talking about how much a society needs to come together, what better freaking example for the people of Israel than what we just saw? You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. I'd agree. I'd say that's what's most exciting about what happened here. I mentioned a few times I'm not hopeful the coalition will last. Did you explain why you think it will last? Maybe we could end it with that. We're going on 2.5 hours. Yeah. Maybe you could explain why you think it will last, and then we'll do 2 audience questions too. So friends, ask now.
I think that, yeah, it's really what I just said now. It's that there's all these different checks and balances that are sort of working out, because if you compare the Israeli system to the American system, it's a little weird in the sense that members of the legislature are also the executive, right? Because think about it, like, the people who are running the government ministries are also members of the parliament. So in a way, you get to not only make the law, but you also get to enforce the law that you just made. So that's like a weird thing. And there are checks and balances that exist within the system of that. Perhaps the greatest check and balance is just to form a Supreme Court, which is very powerful in Israel. Love it or hate it. It's a very powerful institution. But I think that in addition to those sort of like institutional checks and balances, this coalition is very invested in making those checks and balances because of its diversity in a way that I think might actually stabilize it. Not that it's gonna, this is gonna be the new normal in Israel, but I do think that it might last more than a couple months. I think that there's some power sharing agreements here, and they're so unified around. I mean, look, everyone who didn't like the idea of this government kept poo-pooing it by saying that the minute that Netanyahu isn't there, there's nothing to unify them anymore. But Netanyahu isn't in a hurry to go anywhere. So like, I don't think neither are they. You know what I mean? Like he's gonna fight this legal thing tooth and nail. He's gonna try and stick around for a long time. So I think that's what's gonna keep him in addition to the fact that they're building in these institutional safeguards.
I get what you're saying. The fact that like what they did was so spectacular that they're not going to let it crumble so quickly, that it took 12 years. It took 12 years.
Yeah, I think it's that. And it's also Netanyahu's the same way. It's like now is the first time he's been deprived of that thing that he values most. And he's in a hurry to get it back or to get back to that seat as soon as possible. And provided that he doesn't get, locked up in the next like year or so, that's the only thing. Like him being behind bars is the only thing I could see that would really lead to a dissolution of this government, like a definite dissolution of this government, And I don't see that as an inevitable, like not inevitable, but I don't see it as an immediate thing that's going to happen right away.
Right.
I would love to see this government make one piece of legislation together and enact it, and like have a couple months to govern just to show it can be done.
Yep. Let's see. Interesting times ahead. What I care, I mean, I want to see the status quo change more than anything. The current situation will always produce more rounds of violence. It's unsustainable. We can't accept this as our destiny. Not practically, not morally. So, and to be honest, I guess I'm least optimistic about this changing the status quo. I'm just more interested to see some fresh faces in there and what they could do. But yeah, time will tell. Okay, we'll take 2 questions. By the way, if you're new here, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe. I think we lost a few of our subscribers in this session. By the way, Abby Martin also, we lost a fair amount of subscribers from the Abby Martin video. It happens. By the way, tomorrow night we're actually debunking Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA. So we're taking on the other side of the spectrum. We're going to be debunking Charlie Kirk. He did a very cringe. It's just like a take he made, super cringe. We're going to take that one down. And then Sunday, I'm actually doing a one-on-one debate with a settler, which I've actually never. It'll be the first time we do a one-on-one debate with myself on this channel. We'll see how it goes. It's going to be interesting.
Is there going to be like a caveat during that, like a hashtag not all settlers or something?
Yeah, I like that hashtag. He's an interesting guy. He's a smart guy. I definitely appreciate his perspective. And he if I didn't see a side of him that was like, if I didn't think he would come in and genuinely engage in good faith and was actually genuinely interested in making the situation better, then I wouldn't waste my time. But yeah. He does check those boxes. So so Shai asks an interesting question. What do you think can be the Arab-Israeli role in the peace process? So what role do Israeli Arabs play? Thanks for the question, Shai. Look, in general, I very much believe that the people need to be more involved in the peace process. I think regardless of what political solution we have, we're going to need a reconciliation process. Some parts of reconciliation can also come from a political solution, but the people are going to need to be ready to getting to know their neighbors, being open to engaging with their neighbors, learning about them, acknowledging the harm that our side has caused them, and vice versa. And I realized I had a conversation with the Palestinian friend today. He's going to be on the show in the next few weeks, but he very much said he thinks Israel needs to give a national apology as part of reconciliation, and I agree with that. I think that would definitely help with reconciliation. But I told him that I don't see Israelis getting on board with an apology if they don't get one in return, because Israelis very much feel like they're the ones who Israelis will acknowledge that we have a better deal. We're not suffering as much as the Palestinians, but we very much feel like the Palestinians have wronged us time and time again. And started with in the Hebron massacre, and then in '48 when our independence resulted in 5 nations attacking us. So Israelis very much feel like Palestinians have continuously tried to destroy them. And I told him that I definitely support a national apology. Israel as a nation apologizing to the Palestinian people, I think it would help reconciliation. But I did express that I don't think that Israel would ever get on board with it if it wasn't mutual, if it wasn't returned to them. And then we both acknowledge that Palestinians even thinking about the concept of apologizing when they've always had the worst end of the deal seems so foreign. So I don't even have a solution to this. I do think that a mutual apology is helpful, but I also do understand that given the power dynamic and how much worse one side has had it, it's very tricky to expect it from both sides. I still think we should try to work towards there. But back to what I was saying, the people need to be involved in the reconciliation process. Israeli Arabs very much can work as a bridge between our people. They understand what it means to be Israeli to a large extent. Maybe they don't fully connect with Jewish Israelis. Maybe many of them don't feel fully equal to Israeli Jews. But a lot of them do have an Israeli identity, and they live in Israel. But many of them also have a Palestinian identity. Their culture is more similar to the Palestinians. Their language is the same. So they very much can be one of the leading forces of this much needed reconciliation process. So I do think they play an important role. I do.
I'm like a little confused about the role. Like, I think they need to play a role. I think what's really interesting, what we saw in this last round of protesting, rioting, what happened within Israel, is that there's a really interesting like crisis of identity that exists within Arabs who live in Israel's borders, in the sense that they don't want to live under Palestinian governance by any stretch of the imagination. Like, we have a lot of opinion polling that shows this. And at the same time, they still very much in their identity, like, identify as Palestinian. It's a weird cognitive dissonance that exists, where like you see yourself as part of the Israeli state, and you want the Israeli state to make you feel a part of it, but at the same time, you would see doing too much of that as a negation of your other like national identity. So I think that it just needs to we need to find a way in Israeli society writ large to sort of like make a kind of space that makes sense for Arabs living in Israel to feel more Israeli in whatever way that means. And like, it's tough because it's a Jewish state and a democratic state, but there are things about being an Israeli that aren't as connected to either part of that you can kind of make space for. And like, maybe I think that the biggest thing that Arab Israelis can do for the peace process is only going to happen after Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis really like learn not just to, as one person put it, not just coexistence, but like cooperation and mutual like prospering together, like in partnership, not coexistence.
I agree. Well said. Let's see. There's a few. Which one do we want to take? What in your opinion is the key? This is a question from Dan. What in your opinion is the key for the growth of the Israeli left? Well, first there's the question of Ari, do you want the left in Israel to grow? I could answer that. For me, it's not even necessarily about growing the left. I would like the left to grow quite substantially, but if the right will become more peace-oriented and more committed to solving the conflict, then I'd be perfectly okay with that. I don't think, I don't think that the right is innately and inherently hawkish. I do think that you could see peace coming out of the right. So I would say that's also a good option. Me being fairly solidified on the, at least left of center, you could say, on most issues. Actually, again, I'm gonna go back to the point where whether you're left or right, I want more people to be dedicated in the peace process, and I think what needs to happen for that to happen is having good leadership that inspire hope in a nation. Right now, 70-something% of Israelis don't think we'll solve the conflict in the next 100 years. There's a poll from a few years ago, and it's like 93% of Palestinians or 91% of Palestinians. With such levels of despair, why would any individual act for peace when they don't think it's possible, right? It's literally an expensive energy for something that won't yield results. Why would somebody do that? We need a leader to give the people hope, to show us that it's possible, to show us that this conflict could be solved. I think we often underestimate the ability one charismatic individual can have on the general population. I think people are not as ideologically driven as most think. I think we're easier to convince than many think, and one good leader can inspire a nation and really change the views of many. That's one thing that I think would definitely make Israelis more peace-oriented. Another is if out of the Palestinian side births a genuine nonviolent peace movement, one that is dedicated to engaging with Israelis, sharing with Israelis their struggle, building a coalition of Israelis and Palestinians for the Palestinian struggle. If Israelis see that there's a movement of Palestinians that acknowledge Israel's right to exist, but yet are fighting for Palestinian national aspirations, that will have the ability to convince many Israelis that we're not destined for war and conflict with one another. So I'd say those two things.
I think I'm going to take a much simpler approach, which is that I come sort of from the sorry, but Star Hopper's last comment.
I know. Hold on. I'm going to share this. This is gold.
That's kind of funny.
This is the Middle East, Adar, not frickin' Burning Man. Fair.
Yeah, sorry, that was just too good to ignore. I come from a political strategy background, and the biggest failure of the Israeli left is the fact that they just haven't delivered in years. And if you want the Israeli left to grow, presumably because you think that that's the way of making inroads in the peace process, which is in and of itself, that's something that we can challenge, right? There's maybe more incentive or more willpower on the Israeli left to initiate the peace process, but historically right-wing governments are the ones that have made peace deals. So there's a weird thing to work out there, but I digress. If you want the Israeli left to grow, they need to deliver something, because they've spent so many years being ineffective in the government. And for a long time, it was because they were trying to, the hill they were dying on was the issue of the conflict, when there couldn't be any actual deliverables on the conflict at that particular moment in time. Not to say that it can't be done, but at that moment in time, that was something they were focusing on at the expense of social issues that they could have made progress on. I think that this government, maybe in the fact that it excludes the ultra-Orthodox parties, if the left-wing parties, if parties like Meretz can work together with Yisrael Beitenu and with Ram and with Yamina and all these other ones to sort of like, let's say, break the religious monopoly of the rabbinate in Israel and sort of liberate a lot of secular Israeli Jews from the stranglehold over religion and state that currently exists. That's a tremendous deliverable that these parties can present, to show themselves not just as, these like very nice principled opposition parties, but as real movers and shakers in Israeli society and worth the vote, worth that trust. So I think that it needs to start with things like that now that they're in the perfect position to do, they need to do like a lot fast and build up their credibility.
Cool. I like that. Yeah. We gave very different answers. So great spectrum.
I would you'd be like talking to the people of a country and how to make peace, and I would be telling a guy how to get reelected. That's the difference.
Yeah, all types are needed. Cool. Chat. Do y'all want to do an after party on Discord? If we get let's get 7 emojis in chat, and we'll do an after party. If not, no after party. That will be the people voting. If you want to get in touch with Ari, you could find his email in the description. You can find my contact information as well. If you're new here, like and subscribe. We do a few live streams a week. Our goal is to reconcile between people in conflict, primarily Israelis and Palestinians. And I'm going to one last time share the BBS. BBS is like a forum like Reddit built on blockchain. We just opened one for Sulha. It's where we just launched it. There's not much there now, but we're going to be sharing posts and ideas and content, and you earn actual money for joining and making content. It's built on blockchain. There's a built-in token economy. If you have any questions about it, let me know. We did have a little blockchain chat today. If people want to see more blockchain combos, talk to me. We'll set it up. All right, so it's always a pleasure having you. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, don't ask me on for another blockchain chat. I'm so out of my depth. Like, I get it, but I don't get it, And but actually it was really like good discussion. Getting through all the Israeli politics aspect of it was like tedious, but also needed to be done. And also, put an asterisk next to everything. We don't know what's going to happen, and we're all sort of waiting with bated breath. And I think that, maybe if I can speak on behalf of like a lot of Israelis, we're really hoping that this is the beginning of something awesome. And, just send your good vibes our way, and maybe things will get better here for everyone involved. So.
Amen, brother. I'm going to drop a Discord link. Let's see how the after party goes. I'm not going to join, but whoever wants, join Discord. On the left-hand side, it'll say lounge. Click the lounge and you'll be connected via voice. It's just a chat where people share ideas. Ari, would you want to join the after party, or?
I'm pretty tired.
Same. We're going on 3 hours. So,
all right.
Thank you for your stamina and your persistence. We did it. Alex is asking if I have children. No, I do not have children, and I don't know if I ever want to have children. I'm an uncle to 2 amazing nieces and a nephew on the way, but I so much enjoy my freedom, and children literally strip that away from you.
Oof.
I was going to make an analogy that having children is like living in occupied territories, but that's
the most anti-human.
I know that. No. I'm Josh, and that's offensive not only to parents but also to Palestinians. So it was very much a joke.
How about children?
What?
How about children? It's kind of
here's the thing. I love children, but I like to be able to check out. To be a good father, to be a good parent, you need to really be emotionally available. You need to be there with them for many hours of the day. And I really enjoy my alone time. I like to be able to check out. I like to be able to do my own thing. And I realize that it's a sacrifice of a good amount of years. I'm only 31. I have time to decide. Honestly, this is one of the greatest privileges of being a man, is that we don't have the same pressure that women have to make a decision about having children so early. If I was a woman, I would definitely feel more pressure to make that decision. Biological clock and all, I don't feel that pressure. Maybe when I'm 40, who knows? Maybe by mistake, who knows? But no plan for children in the near future, at least not for me. It's amazing being an uncle. Anyways.
On that note.
Much love, friends. See you in the after party if you come. If not, see you tomorrow for the debunking of Charlie Kirk.